Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Tonight, we're diving into some genuinely heartwarming stories that I think you're really going to connect with. Whether you're winding down after a crazy day at work, dealing with your own stuff, are stressed from school, or just need something real to listen to while you relax. These stories are going to remind you that we're all figuring this out together. These aren't dramatic breakdowns or wild family feuds, just honest moments from those who learned something important about life, love, and everything in between. So grab whatever you're working on, get comfortable, and let's jump into some stories that might just give you exactly the perspective you didn't know you needed. These come from people who are brave enough to share the moments that changed them. And trust me, by the end of this, you're going to feel a little less alone in whatever you're going through. Let's start with this first story about learning one of the hardest lessons we all have to face at some point. The relationship that broke me but taught me boundaries. I'm 28 now, and looking back, I can see exactly where everything went wrong. But at the time, I thought I was doing everything right by staying and fighting for us. I met Jake when I was 24, fresh out of college and working my first real job. He was charming, funny, and had this way of making me feel like I was the most important person in the room. For the first few months, everything felt perfect. He'd surprise me with little gifts, remember details about my day, and we'd stay up talking until 3 a.m. about our dreams and fears. But slowly, things started changing. It wasn't dramatic at first, just little comments here and there. He'd make jokes about my friends, saying they were too loud or too dramatic. When I'd get excited about work accomplishments, he'd find ways to downplay them or redirect the conversation back to his own achievements. I told myself he was just having a bad day, or that he was stressed about his job. The real turning point came about 8 months in. I had planned a surprise birthday party for him, spent weeks coordinating with his friends and family, and put together what I thought was going to be an amazing celebration. When the day came, he seemed irritated from the moment people started arriving. He barely thanked me, spent most of the night on his phone, and afterward told me the whole thing was too much and that I should have asked him what he wanted instead of assuming. I was crushed, but I apologized. I actually apologized for trying to do something nice for him. That's when I should have seen the pattern, but instead I convinced myself I needed to try harder to understand what he needed from me. Over the next year and a half, I found myself walking on eggshells constantly. I stopped making plans without checking with him first. I started declining invitations from friends because he'd get moody when I chose to spend time with other people. I even turned down a promotion at work because it would have meant occasional travel, and he said long distance wouldn't work for our relationship. The final straw came when my mum was in the hospital for emergency surgery. I was terrified and needed to drive 3 hours to be with my family. When I called Jake to let him know what was happening, his first response wasn't concern for my mum or support for me. It was annoyance that I was cancelling our dinner plans without asking him first. He actually said, "Well, what am I supposed to do for dinner now?" That moment, sitting in my car in the hospital parking lot, I realised I had completely lost myself. I was 26 years old and asking permission to visit my own mother in the hospital. I had become someone I didn't recognise, someone who prioritised a man's dinner plans over my family's crisis. Breaking up with Jake was one of the hardest things I've ever done. Not because I still loved him, but because I had to face how much I had given up of myself to keep him happy. I had to rebuild friendships I had neglected, rediscover hobbies I had abandoned, and learn to make decisions based on what I wanted instead of what would avoid conflict. It took almost 2 years of being single to fully understand what had happened to me. I wasn't stupid or weak. I had just never learned how to set boundaries. I thought love meant accommodating someone else's needs at the expense of my own. I thought compromise meant always being the one to give in. Now I'm in a relationship with someone who celebrates my successes instead of diminishing them, who encourages my friendships instead of competing with them, and who would never make me choose between him and my family. The difference is night and day, but I wouldn't have been able to recognize healthy love if I hadn't experienced the alternative first. That relationship with Jake broke me in a lot of ways, but it also taught me the most important lesson of my adult life. You can't love someone into treating you well. You can only decide what you will and won't accept, and then have the courage to walk away when those boundaries are crossed. It's a lesson I hope I never have to learn again, but I'm grateful I learned it when I did. That story ends there. Sometimes the most painful relationships become our greatest teachers, even when we wouldn't wish the experience on anyone else. Learning to value yourself enough to walk away from someone who doesn't see your worth is one of the hardest but most essential life skills. That OP saved themselves years of heartache by finally recognizing their own value. Our next story takes us in a completely different direction, to the kind of job that nobody dreams of having, but somehow teaches you everything you didn't know you needed to learn. The job I hated that made me appreciate work. I was 17 and desperate for summer money before my senior year of high school. My parents had made it clear that if I wanted a car, I was going to have to pay for it myself, and flipping burgers at the local McDonald's seemed like the fastest way to earn the cash I needed. I remember walking in for my first day thinking this would be easy money. How hard could it be to flip burgers and take orders? I figured I'd work a few shifts a week, maybe 15 hours total, and by the end of summer I'd have enough saved up for a decent used car. Reality hit me like a brick wall on day one. The breakfast rush started at 5:30 in the morning, and by 6 a.m. the place was absolutely insane. Orders were flying in faster than I could process them. The grill was hotter than anything I'd ever experienced, and customers were getting impatient when their food wasn't ready in under 2 minutes. My manager Carlos was this guy in his 40s who had been working fast food for over 20 years. At first I thought he was just mean. He'd bark instructions at me, correct me when I messed up orders, and never seemed satisfied with my speed or accuracy. I spent the first week convinced he had it out for me personally, but by the second week I started to understand what Carlos was trying to teach me. Every movement in that kitchen had to be precise and efficient. There was no time to waste, no room for sloppy work, and absolutely no tolerance for giving up when things got overwhelming. He wasn't being mean, he was trying to help me survive in an environment that would eat you alive if you couldn't keep up. The heat was the worst part. Even with the industrial fans running constantly, the temperature near the grill would hit over 100 degrees during busy periods. My uniform would be completely soaked with sweat within the first hour, and I'd go through 3 or 4 shirts during a single shift. I'd come home exhausted, smelling like grease and onions, with burns on my arms from accidentally brushing against hot surfaces. But something started changing around week 3. I began to anticipate rushes before they hit. I could tell when we were going to run out of fries just by looking at the line forming outside. I started timing my burger flips perfectly, keeping multiple orders straight in my head, and moving through the kitchen with the kind of efficiency that had seemed impossible just weeks earlier. Carlos noticed the change too. He started giving me more responsibility, teaching me how to manage inventory, showing me the tricks that separated experienced workers from newcomers. He told me about his own kids, how he'd been supporting his family with this job for years, and how he took pride in running the cleanest, most efficient kitchen in the district. The customers taught me patience in ways I never expected. There was the elderly woman who came in every Tuesday for a senior coffee and would spend 10 minutes counting out exact change. The construction workers who'd order massive meals during their lunch break and always left good tips when you remembered their usual orders. The stressed parents with screaming kids who just needed their food fast so they could get back on the road. I learned that every person walking through those doors had their own story, their own struggles, and their own reasons for needing fast, affordable food. Some were travelling families on tight budgets. Others were people working multiple jobs who didn't have time to cook at home. A few were homeless individuals spending their last few dollars on a warm meal. By the end of the summer, I had saved enough money for my car, but I had gained something much more valuable. I understood what real work looked like. Not the kind of work where you sit at a desk and check your phone between tasks. but the kind where every minute counts, where your performance directly affects your co-workers, and where there's dignity in doing any job well. When I started college that fall, I had a completely different perspective on money. Every dollar I had earned represented time spent in that sweltering kitchen, dealing with difficult customers and pushing through exhaustion. I couldn't waste money carelessly anymore because I knew exactly how much effort went into earning it. I also gained massive respect for service workers everywhere. I understood why restaurant workers get frustrated when customers change their orders multiple times. I knew how much effort goes into keeping a kitchen clean and organised. I appreciated the skill it takes to manage multiple tasks under pressure while maintaining a friendly attitude. That summer job was miserable in a lot of ways, but it taught me more about work ethic, patience, and the value of money than any class or lecture ever could. It showed me that there's honour in any job done well, and that the people working these positions deserve respect and decent treatment. Now, whenever I go into any restaurant or service establishment, I remember those lessons. I tip well, I'm patient when there are delays, and I always try to treat workers with kindness, because I know how much that can mean during a difficult shift. That job I hated ended up shaping my entire approach to work and money for the rest of my life. That story wraps up there. There's something beautiful about how the jobs we think we're too good for often teach us the most about character and resilience. That OP learned more about real work in one summer than most people learn in years of easier positions. Sometimes the experiences we want to forget become the foundation for everything we value later. Let's move on to a story about failure and how sometimes the thing that embarrasses us most becomes exactly what we needed to grow. The time I failed my driving test, I was 16 and absolutely convinced I was going to ace my driving test on the first try. I'd been practicing with my dad for months. I knew the rules of the road inside and out, and I'd watched enough driving videos on YouTube to feel like an expert behind the wheel. The night before my test, I barely slept. I kept going over parallel parking techniques in my head, reviewing hand signals I'd probably never use, and imagining the moment I'd walk out of the DMV with my brand new license. All my friends had passed on their first attempt, and I was confident I'd be no different. My appointment was at 10 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. My dad drove me to the DMV, and I could feel my heart racing as we pulled into the parking lot. The testing area was busy with other nervous teenagers and their parents, all of us going through the same rite of passage. When my name was called, I met my driving instructor, a middle-aged woman named Mrs. Rodriguez, who had the kind of expression that gave nothing away. She checked my paperwork, explained the route we'd be taking, and climbed into the passenger seat of my dad's car. The first part of the test went perfectly. I adjusted my mirrors, fastened my seatbelt, and pulled out of the parking space with textbook precision. We drove through a residential neighbourhood where I carefully observed every speed limit sign, came to complete stops at stop signs, and signalled well in advance of every turn. I was feeling confident as we approached the parallel parking portion of the test. I'd practiced this manoeuvre hundreds of times in empty parking lots with my dad. I knew exactly how to line up the mirrors, when to start turning the wheel, and how to straighten out at the end. But something went wrong. Maybe it was nerves, maybe the space was tighter than what I'd practiced with, or maybe I just overthought the whole process. I pulled up next to the car in front of the space, started backing up, and immediately knew I was at the wrong angle. Instead of stopping and readjusting, I tried to correct it while still backing up. The result was a disaster. I ended up with my car diagonal across the parking space, blocking half the street, with my rear bumper about 6 inches from the car behind me. Mrs. Rodriguez calmly told me to pull forward and straighten out, which took 3 attempts and probably looked ridiculous to anyone watching. The rest of the test didn't go much better. I was flustered from the parallel parking failure, and it affected everything else. I rolled through a stop sign without realising it, forgot to check my blind spot during a lane change, and took a turn too fast in the DMV parking lot. When Mrs. Rodriguez told me I hadn't passed, I felt like the ground had opened up beneath me. She handed me a paper listing all my mistakes, explained that I could retake the test in 2 weeks, and wished me luck with more practice. I walked back to where my dad was waiting, trying not to cry from embarrassment. The drive home was quiet and humiliating. My dad tried to be encouraging, saying that lots of people fail their first time, but I knew he was disappointed too. We'd been planning to celebrate with lunch at my favourite restaurant, but instead we drove home in silence, while I stared out the window, feeling like a complete failure. What made it worse was explaining to my friends why I still didn't have my licence. They were all driving themselves to school, while I was still getting rides from my parents. I felt like everyone was looking at me differently, like I was the kid who couldn't handle basic adult responsibilities. But failing that test turned out to be one of the best things that could have happened to me. Instead of just passing and thinking I was a great driver, I had to face the reality that I needed more practice. My dad and I spent the next 2 weeks working on parallel parking every single day. We found empty lots, set up cones, and practiced the maneuver until I could do it perfectly every time. We also worked on other skills I'd been overconfident about. I learned to check my blind spots automatically, to come to complete stops instead of rolling through signs, and to stay calm under pressure instead of getting flustered when things didn't go according to plan. When I retook the test 2 weeks later, I passed easily, but more importantly, I was actually a better driver because of the extra practice. The parallel parking that had been my downfall was now one of my strongest skills. I felt genuinely confident behind the wheel, instead of just thinking I was confident. Over the years, I've realised that failing my driving test taught me something valuable about preparation and humility. It showed me that being overconfident can be just as dangerous as being unprepared, and that sometimes failure is exactly the motivation you need to actually master something, instead of just getting by. Now I'm in my 30s and I'm still a careful, thoughtful driver. I think that early failure made me more aware of my limitations and more committed to continuous improvement. If I had passed that first test, I might have developed bad habits that would have made me a worse driver in the long run. That story comes to an end there. Sometimes our most embarrassing moments become our greatest teachers, forcing us to develop skills we might have never bothered to perfect otherwise. That OP learned that overconfidence can be just as dangerous as lack of preparation, and that real mastery comes from facing our failures head-on instead of avoiding them. Our next story is about one of those small moments that stays with you forever, proving that kindness from strangers can be just as powerful as love from family. The stranger who paid for my bus fare. I was 19 and running late for my job at a bookstore downtown. I'd been working there for about 3 months, and I was still in that phase where I was terrified of being late or making any mistakes that might get me fired. That morning, everything that could go wrong did go wrong. My alarm didn't go off, I couldn't find my work shirt, and by the time I finally made it to the bus stop, I was already 15 minutes behind schedule. I was that person running down the street with my shoes half tied, probably looking completely frantic to anyone watching. When the bus finally arrived, I climbed on and reached into my pocket for my bus pass, only to realise it wasn't there. I frantically checked all my pockets, then my backpack, then my pockets again. Nothing. I must have left it on my dresser in my rush to get out the door. The bus driver was this older guy who looked like he'd seen every possible passenger situation over the years. He waited patiently while I searched through my stuff, but I could feel the other passengers getting annoyed behind me. Someone actually sighed loudly when I started checking my pockets for the third time. I finally found $2.37 in loose change at the bottom of my bag. The fare was $2.50. I was 13 cents short, which might as well have been $13 when you're standing on a bus holding up everyone's morning commute. I started to explain to the driver that I'd left my pass at home, asking if there was any way he could let me ride, and I'd pay the difference tomorrow. Before he could answer, the woman sitting in the front seat stood up and dropped a quarter into the fare box. She didn't make a big deal about it. She didn't even look at me directly. She just put the quarter in, sat back down, and went back to reading her book like nothing had happened. The whole interaction took maybe 5 seconds, but I stood there for a moment, completely stunned by this tiny act of kindness. I managed to stammer out a thank you, but she just waved me off with a small smile and kept reading. I found a seat near the back and spent the entire ride thinking about what had just happened. This woman didn't know me, didn't owe me anything, and had absolutely no reason to help me out of my own carelessness. But she did it anyway, without hesitation, without making me feel embarrassed or grateful in an uncomfortable way. It was such a small thing, 25 cents, but in that moment, it felt huge. She had saved me from being late to work, from having to walk 40 minutes downtown, from starting my day feeling like a complete mess. I made it to work with 2 minutes to spare, and I remember feeling this incredible lightness for the rest of the day. Not just because I hadn't been late, but because someone had been kind to me for absolutely no reason other than seeing that I needed help. I've thought about that woman hundreds of times over the years. I never saw her again, never got to properly thank her or tell her how much that moment meant to me. But her kindness stuck with me in a way that changed how I move through the world. Now, whenever I see someone struggling with exact change, or looking lost, or clearly having a rough day, I remember that woman with her quarter. I've paid for people's coffee when their cards get declined, given directions to tourists who look confused, and helped carry groceries for elderly people struggling with heavy bags. None of these things cost me much, just like that quarter didn't cost her much. But I know from experience that small kindnesses can completely change someone's day, maybe even their perspective on humanity in general. That 25 cents taught me that kindness doesn't have to be grand or expensive or life-changing. Sometimes it's just noticing when someone needs help and quietly providing it without making them feel worse about their situation. It's being the person who makes someone else's day a little easier instead of a little harder. I still carry extra change in my pocket sometimes, just in case I encounter someone in the same situation I was in that day. It's my way of paying forward a kindness that happened over a decade ago, but still influences how I try to treat people. That story ends there. Sometimes the smallest gestures create the biggest ripples. One quarter from a stranger taught that OP more about human kindness than any grand gesture ever could. It's beautiful how these tiny moments of decency can reshape our entire approach to living in the world with other people. Moving on to a story about family and how sometimes the fights that hurt us most can actually bring us closer together than we ever imagined possible. The argument with my sister that made us closer. My sister Emma is 3 years older than me, and growing up, we were typical siblings. We'd fight over everything, steal each other's clothes, and generally drive our parents crazy with our constant bickering. But we also had each other's backs when it mattered, and I always assumed we'd stay close as adults. When I was 22 and she was 25, we had the biggest fight of our lives over something that seems almost silly now, but felt earth-shattering at the time. Our grandmother had passed away and left behind this beautiful antique necklace that had been in our family for generations. Both Emma and I had always loved it, and we'd both assumed we'd inherit it someday. The problem was, our grandmother's will was vague about who should get specific jewellery pieces. It just said to be divided among the granddaughters. Emma, being the oldest granddaughter, felt like she had the strongest claim to it. I felt like since I was the one who had spent the most time with our grandmother in her final years, visiting her every week and helping her with errands, I had earned it. The fight started over dinner at our parents' house when we were going through our grandmother's things. Emma picked up the necklace and said she was planning to wear it to her upcoming wedding. I told her I thought we should discuss it as a family before anyone claimed anything. She said there was nothing to discuss since she was the oldest. That's when I lost it. I accused her of being selfish and entitled, of thinking she deserved everything just because she was born first. She fired back that I was jealous of her engagement and trying to ruin her wedding planning. We said horrible things to each other, things we'd been holding back for years about old resentments and perceived favoritism from our parents. The fight escalated until we were both crying and screaming, bringing up every slight and disappointment from our childhood. I told her she was self-centered and had always gotten everything handed to her. She told me I was immature and needed to stop acting like the victim all the time. Our parents tried to mediate, but we were both too angry to listen to reason. Emma stormed out with the necklace, and I didn't speak to her for the next 4 months. We avoided each other at family gatherings, communicated only through our parents, and generally acted like children despite being grown women. The silence between us stretched through the holidays, through her wedding planning, through what should have been one of the happiest times in her life. Our parents were heartbroken watching their daughters refuse to speak to each other over a piece of jewellery, no matter how meaningful it was. The turning point came when Emma called me at 2 a.m, crying so hard I could barely understand what she was saying. Her fiancé had called off their wedding 3 weeks before the ceremony. He'd been having second thoughts for months, but hadn't had the courage to tell her until it was almost too late. Despite our fight, despite months of not talking, my first instinct was to grab my keys and drive to her apartment. I found her sitting on her living room floor, surrounded by wedding planning materials, looking more broken than I'd ever seen her. We didn't talk about the necklace that night. We didn't talk about our fight or who was right or wrong. I just held my sister while she cried and helped her figure out how to cancel vendors and return wedding gifts. We stayed up until sunrise, making phone calls and eating ice cream directly from the container. Over the next few weeks, as Emma dealt with the aftermath of her cancelled wedding, we slowly started rebuilding our relationship. We talked about why we'd fought so viciously, about old hurts we'd been carrying around for years, about how we'd both felt like we had to compete for our parents' attention growing up. We realised that the necklace had never really been about the necklace. It had been about feeling valued, about wanting proof that we mattered to our grandmother and to each other. We'd both been dealing with our own insecurities and had projected them onto this family heirloom. Eventually, Emma came up with a solution that was so simple, I couldn't believe we hadn't thought of it during our original fight. She suggested we take turns with the necklace, switching every year on our grandmother's birthday. That way, we'd both get to wear it and feel connected to her memory, and neither of us would have to give up that connection permanently. The first time we made the exchange, we met at our grandmother's grave and told her about our plan. It felt like closure and a new beginning at the same time. Emma wore it for the first year, and when she passed it to me the following year, it felt like she was giving me something much more valuable than jewellery. That fight taught us both that we'd rather have each other than be right about who deserved what. It showed us that family relationships require forgiveness, compromise, and the willingness to admit when you've been wrong. Most importantly, it proved that even the worst conflicts can lead to deeper understanding if both people are willing to do the work to repair the damage. Emma got remarried 2 years later to someone who deserved her, and I was her maid of honour. She wore our grandmother's necklace, and during her speech at the reception, she talked about how the most important thing our grandmother had taught us was that family love is stronger than family fights. Now we're closer than we've ever been. We talk every week, vacation together, and laugh about how we almost lost each other over a piece of jewellery. That necklace still gets passed between us every year, but it's no longer just about our grandmother's memory. It's about the relationship we almost threw away and were lucky enough to rebuild. That story concludes there. Sometimes the fights that threaten to destroy relationships end up making them stronger than they ever were before. Emma and the OP learned that being sisters meant more than being right, and that real love requires the courage to forgive and start over. The necklace became a symbol of their renewed bond rather than the thing that divided them. Let's move to a story about one of the most fundamental life skills we all have to learn, often through spectacular failure and embarrassing mistakes. The summer I learned to cook. I was 20 years old and moving into my first apartment with 2 roommates. Up until that point, I'd lived on campus where meal plans took care of everything, or at home where my mum did most of the cooking. I could make basic things like scrambled eggs and sandwiches, but I'd never attempted anything that required actual skill or technique. My roommates, Jake and Sarah, were both decent cooks who had grown up helping their families in the kitchen. They'd casually mention making stir-fry for dinner or baking bread from scratch, and I'd nod along like I knew what they were talking about, while secretly panicking about how I was going to feed myself for an entire year. The first week in our new place, we decided to take turns cooking dinner for the group. It seemed like a great way to save money and bond as roommates. Jake went first and made this incredible pasta dish with homemade sauce. Sarah followed with a curry that was better than anything I'd ever ordered at a restaurant. Then it was my turn. I decided to attempt something that seemed foolproof: spaghetti with meat sauce. How hard could it be? You boil pasta, you brown some ground beef, you add sauce from a jar. Even I couldn't mess that up, right? Wrong. I managed to burn the ground beef while simultaneously undercooking it, which I didn't even know was possible. I added way too much salt to the sauce and didn't add enough water to the pasta pot, so half the noodles weren't even submerged. The kitchen filled with smoke from the burning meat, and when I finally served dinner, the pasta was crunchy, and the sauce tasted like it had been seasoned with ocean water. Jake and Sarah were incredibly polite about it, but I could see them struggling to swallow each bite. We ended up ordering pizza that night, and I felt like a complete failure. Here I was, a college junior who couldn't manage one of the most basic meals in existence. But instead of giving up, I decided to treat cooking like any other skill I needed to learn. I started watching YouTube videos obsessively, taking notes on techniques and timing. I bought a basic cookbook and started with the absolute simplest recipes, things designed for people who had never turned on a stove before. My second attempt was scrambled eggs, which seemed safe since I'd made them before. But following the cookbook's technique instead of just winging it, I learned about low heat and constant stirring and adding a little cream at the end. Those eggs were better than any I'd ever made, and that small success gave me the confidence to keep trying. The failures kept coming though. I burned grilled cheese sandwiches, overcooked chicken until it was like rubber, and made rice that was somehow both mushy and undercooked at the same time. I set off the smoke alarm so many times that our neighbours started checking on us whenever they heard it go off. Jake and Sarah became my unofficial cooking coaches, patiently explaining why my onions were burning or why my vegetables were turning to mush. They taught me about preheating pans, about how different vegetables need different cooking times, about tasting as you go, instead of just hoping everything would work out. The breakthrough came about 6 weeks into the summer, when I successfully made a simple chicken stir-fry. The vegetables were still crisp, the chicken was cooked through but not dried out, and the sauce actually tasted like something you'd want to eat. My roommates were genuinely impressed, and I felt this incredible pride in creating something delicious from basic ingredients. From there, I started getting more adventurous. I learned to make a decent tomato sauce from scratch, figured out how to properly season meat, and mastered the art of cooking rice without burning it. Each small success built my confidence to try something slightly more challenging. By the end of the summer, I was making meals that I was actually proud to serve to other people. I'd learned to read recipes carefully, to prep all my ingredients before starting to cook, and to trust my instincts about seasoning and timing. More importantly, I'd learned that failure in the kitchen wasn't the end of the world. It was just part of the learning process. That summer taught me that cooking isn't really about following recipes perfectly. It's about understanding how heat works, how flavors combine, and how to adjust when things don't go according to plan. It's about being patient with yourself while you develop skills that take time to master. Now, 15 years later, I'm the person my friends call when they want to know how to fix a sauce that's too salty or why their bread didn't rise. I love cooking for people and trying new techniques, and some of my happiest memories involve sharing meals I've made with the people I care about. But I still remember those early disasters, and I'm grateful for every burned piece of chicken and overcooked vegetable. They taught me that the best way to learn something is to accept that you're going to be bad at it first, and then keep practicing until you're not. That lesson has served me well in areas far beyond the kitchen. That story ends there. Learning to cook taught the OP way more than just how to feed themselves. It showed them that mastery comes through embracing failure as part of the process, and that even the most basic life skills require patience, practice, and the willingness to start over when things go wrong. Sometimes the best teachers are our own mistakes. Our next story is about one of those moments that seems like a complete disaster at the time, but ends up being exactly what you needed without knowing it. The missed flight that changed my day. I was 25 and travelling to Portland for a job interview that I'd been preparing for weeks. This wasn't just any interview, it was for a position at a design firm I'd been dreaming of working for since college. I had researched every project they'd ever done, memorised the names of all their senior partners, and even bought a new suit specifically for this meeting. My flight was scheduled to leave at 7 a.m, which meant getting to the airport by 5:30 to be safe. I set 3 different alarms, laid out my clothes the night before, and even pre-packed my carry-on bag with my portfolio and all my interview materials. I was not going to let anything go wrong with this opportunity. Of course, everything that could go wrong did go wrong. My first alarm didn't go off because of a power outage during the night. My phone had died because I forgot to plug it in properly. By the time I woke up naturally, it was already 6:15 a.m, and I was in full panic mode. I threw on my interview clothes, grabbed my bag, and called an Uber while running down the stairs of my apartment building. The driver was great and drove as fast as legally possible, but by the time we hit the usual morning traffic jam on the highway, I knew I was cutting it way too close. I made it to the airport at 6:55 a.m, exactly 5 minutes before my flight was supposed to depart. I sprinted through the terminal with my bag bouncing behind me, probably looking like someone running from the law. When I finally made it to my gate, completely out of breath and sweating in my new suit, the gate was empty, except for one airline employee cleaning up. She looked at me sympathetically and confirmed what I already knew in my heart. The flight had left on time, and the next available flight to Portland wasn't until 2 p.m. I was going to miss my interview, and there was absolutely nothing I could do about it. I called the design firm immediately to explain what had happened, hoping they might be able to reschedule for later that day. But their HR person explained that they were interviewing multiple candidates over 2 days, and my slot was the only opening they had. She said they'd keep my resume on file, but I could tell from her tone that this opportunity was gone forever. I was devastated. I found a quiet corner of the airport and just sat there for 20 minutes, feeling sorry for myself. I'd blown my dream job because I couldn't manage to set an alarm properly. It felt like such a stupid, avoidable mistake that was going to derail my entire career trajectory. Since I'd already taken the day off work and paid for a non-refundable ticket, I decided to take the 2 p.m. flight anyway. Maybe I could at least explore Portland for a few hours and make something positive out of this disaster. I changed into more comfortable clothes and tried to salvage what was left of my day. While waiting for my flight, I was sitting in the terminal reading a book when someone sat down next to me. It was a woman about my age with a laptop bag and the kind of tired look that comes from too much business travel. She glanced over at my book and asked if I'd recommend it. We started talking, and I learned that her name was Maya, and she was a graphic designer travelling to Portland for a client meeting. When I mentioned that I was also in design, but had just missed the interview that was supposed to change my life, she was incredibly sympathetic and understanding. Maya told me about her own career path, how she'd started at a small agency and worked her way up to eventually starting her own freelance business. She talked about the ups and downs of the industry, the importance of building a good portfolio, and how sometimes the best opportunities come from unexpected places rather than the jobs you think you want. During our flight, we kept talking about design trends, shared career frustrations, and discovered we had a lot of common interests beyond work. She was funny and insightful, and talking to her made me forget about how upset I was about the missed interview. When we landed in Portland, Maya mentioned that she had a few hours before her client meeting and asked if I wanted to grab coffee and continue our conversation. We found this great little cafe downtown, and she looked through my portfolio, offering genuinely helpful feedback and suggestions for improvement. Then she said something that completely changed everything. Her client meeting that afternoon was with a startup that was looking to hire a full-time designer, and based on our conversation, she thought I might be perfect for the role. She asked if I'd be interested in meeting them informally, just to see if there was mutual interest. 3 hours later, I was sitting in a conference room with the founders of a tech startup, having the most relaxed and engaging job interview of my life. They loved my work, we connected immediately over our shared vision for user-centered design, and by the end of the meeting they were talking about next steps and potential start dates. I got an offer from them the following week, and it turned out to be exactly the kind of creative, collaborative environment I'd been looking for. The salary was better than what the Portland firm had been offering. The projects were more interesting, and the company culture was a perfect fit for my personality and work style. But the best part wasn't even the job. Maya and I stayed in touch after that day, and she became one of my closest friends and most trusted professional mentors. We've collaborated on several projects over the years, and she's the person I call when I need advice about career decisions or just want to bounce ideas off someone who understands the industry. Looking back, missing that flight was one of the best things that ever happened to me. If I'd made it to that interview on time, I probably would have gotten the job I thought I wanted, but I never would have met Maya or discovered the company where I ended up building my career. That missed flight taught me that sometimes what feels like failure is actually the universe redirecting you towards something better. It showed me the importance of staying open to unexpected opportunities and being willing to find the silver lining, even in situations that seem completely hopeless at the time. That story ends there. Sometimes life's biggest disappointments turn out to be perfectly timed redirections towards something better than you originally planned. Maya became both a career mentor and lifelong friend, proving that the connections we make during our lowest moments often end up being the most meaningful. The OP learned that missing one door can lead to discovering a better one you never knew existed. Let's move to a story about one of those teachers who changes everything with just a few words at exactly the right moment. The teacher who believed in me. I was 16 and ready to drop out of high school. Not because I was rebellious or didn't care about my future, but because I genuinely believed I was too stupid to succeed academically. I'd been struggling with undiagnosed learning differences for years, watching my classmates grasp concepts that seemed impossible for me to understand. Math was the worst subject for me. While other kids could solve equations in their heads, I would stare at the same problem for 20 minutes and still have no idea where to start. My test scores were consistently in the bottom 10% of my class, and I'd started to accept that some people were just naturally smart while others, like me, weren't. My parents were supportive, but didn't really understand what I was going through. They'd help me with homework when they could, but they both worked long hours and had limited education themselves. They wanted me to succeed, but didn't have the tools or knowledge to help me figure out why school was so much harder for me than it seemed to be for everyone else. By junior year, I was failing 3 classes and barely passing the others. I'd started skipping school regularly, not to cause trouble, but because sitting in classrooms where I couldn't understand what was happening felt like torture. I was convinced that dropping out and getting a job was the only realistic option for someone with my limited abilities. That's when I ended up in Mr. Patterson's remedial math class. It was basically where they put all the kids who were failing regular math, and most of us had pretty much given up on academics entirely. Mr. Patterson was this older guy, maybe in his 50s, who had been teaching for decades and had seen every type of struggling student you could imagine. On my first day in his class, I sat in the back row and prepared to zone out for another semester of mathematical confusion. But Mr. Patterson did something different from every other math teacher I'd ever had. Instead of jumping straight into formulas and equations, he started by asking us about our experiences with math and why we thought we were struggling. When it was my turn to share, I mumbled something about being bad at numbers and not having a math brain. Mr. Patterson looked directly at me and said something that stopped me cold. He said, "I don't believe in math brains. I believe in math confidence, and confidence can be built with the right approach and enough practice." About over the next few weeks, Mr. Patterson worked with each of us individually to identify where our understanding had broken down. He discovered that I'd been missing fundamental concepts from as far back as elementary school, which explained why more advanced topics seemed impossible. Instead of pushing me to keep up with grade-level work, he helped me fill in those gaps systematically. He taught me that math was like building a house. You couldn't construct the upper floors if the foundation wasn't solid. We spent time on basic concepts that I should have learned years earlier, but he never made me feel stupid or behind. He treated these review sessions like detective work, helping me discover where my knowledge had holes and then fixing them methodically. The breakthrough came about 6 weeks into the semester when I successfully solved a problem that had stumped me for days. It wasn't a particularly advanced equation, but it required understanding several concepts that I'd never fully grasped before. When I got the right answer, Mr. Patterson smiled and said, "See, you do have a math brain. You just needed someone to help you organize it." That moment changed everything for me. For the first time in my academic life, I felt capable of learning something that had always seemed impossible. Mr. Patterson continued working with me throughout the semester, always pushing me just slightly beyond my comfort zone while making sure I had the support I needed to succeed. By the end of junior year, I was passing all my classes for the first time in years. More importantly, I'd developed study strategies and learning techniques that worked for my particular brain. Mr. Patterson had taught me that struggling with certain subjects didn't mean I was stupid. It meant I learned differently and needed different approaches. Senior year, I took regular math classes instead of remedial ones. It was challenging, but I had the confidence and tools to handle the difficulty. I graduated on time with my class, something that had seemed impossible just 2 years earlier. Mr. Patterson attended my graduation ceremony, and afterward I thanked him for everything he'd done for me. He said something that day that I still carry with me 15 years later. He told me that teaching isn't about being smart enough to understand concepts. It's about being persistent enough to keep trying different approaches until something clicks. I went to community college after high school and eventually transferred to a 4-year university where I studied education. I wanted to become the kind of teacher who could help struggling students the way Mr. Patterson had helped me. I'm now a high school teacher myself, working with kids who remind me of my 16-year-old self. Every time I have a student who thinks they're too stupid to learn, I remember what Mr. Patterson taught me about the difference between intelligence and confidence. I share his philosophy that there are no math brains, or English brains, or science brains, just different ways of processing information and different amounts of time needed to build understanding. Mr. Patterson didn't just save my academic career, he taught me that one person believing in your potential can completely change your perception of what you're capable of achieving. That lesson has influenced every aspect of my life, not just my education, but my relationships, career, and approach to challenges in general. That story concludes there. One teacher's refusal to accept that some kids just aren't math people completely transformed that OP's life trajectory. Mr. Patterson understood that confidence and proper foundation matter more than natural ability, and his belief gave a struggling student the tools to succeed. Sometimes the most powerful thing an adult can do is see potential where a young person sees only failure. Moving on to a story about unconditional love and the profound lessons that come from our relationships with animals. The dog that taught me loyalty. When I was 8 years old, my parents finally agreed to let me get a dog after 2 years of relentless begging, negotiating, and promising to take full responsibility for a pet. We went to the local animal shelter on a Saturday morning, and I was convinced I'd know immediately which dog was meant to be mine. I expected to fall in love with a playful puppy or maybe a beautiful golden retriever like the dogs I'd seen in movies. Instead, I found myself drawn to this medium-sized mutt in the corner of the kennel area. He had floppy ears, a greying muzzle, and the saddest eyes I'd ever seen. The shelter volunteer told us his name was Buddy and that he was probably around 6 years old. Buddy had been at the shelter for 8 months, which was unusually long for a dog his size and temperament. He wasn't aggressive or difficult, but he wasn't particularly outgoing either. While other dogs jumped up on the kennel doors seeking attention from potential adopters, Buddy would just sit quietly and watch people pass by. When I asked to meet him, the volunteer brought him into one of the small visiting rooms. Buddy didn't run around or try to play like the other dogs I'd met that day. He just walked over to where I was sitting on the floor and laid his head in my lap. He looked up at me with those expressive eyes, and I knew without any doubt that he was supposed to come home with us. My parents tried to talk me into considering some of the younger, more energetic dogs, pointing out that Buddy might not have as many years left, and that an older dog might not be as much fun for a kid my age. But I was determined. There was something about his quiet dignity and the way he'd immediately trusted me that made me feel protective of him. Buddy came home with us that afternoon, and from day one, he became my constant companion. He slept next to my bed every night, walked with me to the school bus stop every morning, and was waiting by the front door when I came home each afternoon. He wasn't a particularly playful or high-energy dog, but he was steady and reliable in a way that made me feel safe and loved. What amazed me about Buddy was his unwavering loyalty, not just to me, but to our entire family. When my little sister was born 2 years later, he immediately appointed himself as her protector. He would lie next to her crib during naps and gently nudge my parents awake if she started crying during the night. He seemed to understand that she was fragile and important. Buddy taught me responsibility in ways I hadn't expected. Taking care of him wasn't just about feeding him and making sure he had water, though I took those duties seriously. It was about paying attention to his needs, noticing when he wasn't feeling well, and putting his comfort ahead of my own convenience sometimes. There were nights when I wanted to stay inside and watch TV, but I knew Buddy needed his evening walk. There were mornings when I was running late for school, but I still took time to let him out in the backyard and make sure he had food in his bowl. These small acts of daily care taught me that love isn't just a feeling. It's a commitment to showing up consistently for someone who depends on you. As I got older and started spending more time with friends and extracurricular activities, Buddy never made me feel guilty for being away from home. He was always genuinely excited to see me when I returned, whether I'd been gone for 2 hours or 2 days. His happiness at my return was pure and uncomplicated, never tinged with resentment or demands for explanation about where I'd been. During my difficult teenage years, when I was moody and unpredictable and probably not very pleasant to live with, Buddy remained a constant source of comfort and acceptance. He didn't judge me for my bad moods or try to fix my problems. He just stayed close by, offering his quiet presence when I needed it most. When I was dealing with typical teenage drama, friendship conflicts, or academic stress, I would often find myself sitting on the floor of my room talking to Buddy about whatever was bothering me. He would listen with the kind of focused attention that made me feel heard and understood, even though he couldn't offer advice or solutions. Buddy lived to be 14, which gave us 8 wonderful years together. As he got older and his health started declining, I learned about the difficulty of loving someone whose time with you is limited. Watching him slow down and struggle with basic activities that had once been effortless was heartbreaking, but it also taught me to appreciate every ordinary moment we had together. The day we had to say goodbye to Buddy was one of the hardest days of my childhood, but even in that final moment at the veterinarian's office, he taught me something important about love and loyalty. He stayed calm and trusting, seeming to understand that we were making this choice out of love for him rather than giving up on him. Having Buddy during those formative years taught me that love is patient, consistent, and unconditional. He showed me what it means to be loyal, not just during the good times, but especially during the difficult ones. He demonstrated that sometimes the most meaningful relationships are built not on excitement or entertainment, but on quiet devotion and simple presence. Now, as an adult, I try to bring the same kind of steady loyalty to my human relationships that Buddy showed me every day for 8 years. When friends are going through hard times, I remember how much it meant to have someone who would just sit with me without trying to fix everything. When family members are struggling, I think about Buddy's example of offering comfort without judgment. Buddy taught me that loyalty isn't about grand gestures or dramatic declarations. It's about showing up consistently, paying attention to the people you love, and being willing to put their needs ahead of your own convenience. Those lessons have shaped how I approach friendships, romantic relationships, and eventually parenthood. That story ends there. Buddy showed that OP what pure, uncomplicated love looks like, the kind that doesn't keep score or hold grudges. An older shelter dog became the perfect teacher for a young person learning about responsibility, consistency, and what it really means to care for someone else. Sometimes the most profound lessons about human connection come from our relationships with animals who love us exactly as we are. Our next story takes us to one of those childhood moments that stays with you forever, teaching you about safety, love, and just how much you mean to the people who would do anything to protect you. The day I got lost as a child. I was 6 years old and visiting the state fair with my mom, dad, and younger brother. It was one of those perfect family outings that I'd been looking forward to for weeks. The fair had everything a kid could want: carnival rides, games with giant stuffed animal prizes, and more junk food than I could eat in a lifetime. We'd spent the afternoon going on rides and playing games, and I was carrying a huge stuffed elephant I'd won at the ring toss. My little brother was getting tired and cranky, so my parents decided we should head toward the exit and call it a day. I was disappointed because I hadn't gotten to go on the Ferris wheel yet, but I understood that we needed to leave before my brother had a complete meltdown. As we were walking through the crowded midway toward the parking area, something caught my eye at one of the game booths. There was this incredible remote control helicopter that looked exactly like the one I'd been begging my parents to buy me for months. The man running the booth was demonstrating how it worked, making it hover and spin in the air above the crowd. I stopped to watch, completely mesmerized by this helicopter. I was only planning to look for a minute, but the demonstration was so fascinating that I lost track of time. When I finally turned around to catch up with my family, they were nowhere to be seen. At first, I wasn't too concerned. The fair was crowded, and I figured they were just a few steps ahead of me, maybe blocked by other people. I walked in the direction we'd been heading, looking for my dad's red baseball cap or my mum's blue sweater, but after walking for what felt like forever, I still couldn't see them anywhere. That's when the panic started to set in. The crowds that had seemed fun and exciting just minutes earlier now felt overwhelming and scary. Everyone around me was a stranger, and they all seemed so much taller than me. I couldn't see over their heads to look for my family, and the noise of the carnival games and music made it impossible to hear if my parents were calling my name. I started walking faster, then almost running, clutching my stuffed elephant and trying not to cry. Every person wearing a red hat made my heart jump, thinking it might be my dad, but it was always someone else. I began to imagine all the terrible things that could happen to a lost child at a fair, and I was getting more frightened by the minute. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 15 minutes, I decided to stop moving and stay in one place like I'd been taught in school during stranger danger lessons. I found a bench near one of the food stands and climbed up on it so I'd be easier to spot. I was crying by this point, but trying to be brave and remember what my parents had always told me about what to do if I got separated from them. A kind woman who was working at the nearby funnel cake stand noticed me sitting alone and crying. She came over and asked if I was lost, and when I nodded, she told me she was going to help me find my family. She walked me over to the security booth near the main entrance, holding my hand and talking to me in a calm, reassuring voice. The security guard was this friendly, older man who asked me my name and what my parents looked like. He got on his radio and started describing me to other security personnel around the fair. Then he asked if I wanted to make an announcement over the loudspeaker system to let my parents know where I was. Hearing my own voice echoing across the entire fairgrounds was both scary and exciting. I said, "Mommy and Daddy, this is Emma. I'm at the security booth by the front gate with Officer Jim. Please come find me." My voice sounded so small over that big speaker system, but I hoped my parents would hear it wherever they were. Within minutes, I could see my dad running toward the security booth, moving faster than I'd ever seen him run before. My mum was right behind him, and when they reached me, they both grabbed me in the biggest, tightest hug of my life. My mum was crying almost as hard as I was, and my dad kept saying, "We're so sorry, sweetheart. We're so sorry we lost you." They explained that they'd been looking for me frantically for the past 20 minutes. When they realised I wasn't with them, they'd split up to cover more ground, with my dad searching the midway, while my mum stayed near the car in case I made my way to the parking lot. They'd been terrified and were about to ask for help from security when they heard my announcement over the speaker. The ride home was quiet except for my parents occasionally asking if I was okay and reminding me how much they loved me. My little brother had fallen asleep in his car seat, completely unaware of the drama that had unfolded. I sat in the back clutching my stuffed elephant, feeling simultaneously exhausted and incredibly safe. That night, as my mum was tucking me into bed, she talked to me about what had happened and how scared she and my dad had been when they couldn't find me. She explained that sometimes parents make mistakes too, and that they should have been more careful to make sure I was keeping up with them in the crowded fair. But what struck me most was how my mum described the feeling of not knowing where I was. She said it was the worst feeling she'd ever experienced, that all she could think about was making sure I was safe and getting me back in her arms. She told me that being my mum was the most important job she'd ever have, and that protecting me and my brother was her top priority in life. That experience taught me something profound about how much my parents loved me. I'd always known they cared about me, but seeing their panic and relief when they found me showed me the depth of that love in a way I'd never understood before. It made me realise that I wasn't just a kid they were responsible for. I was someone whose safety and well-being was central to their happiness. Getting lost also taught me important lessons about staying calm in scary situations and asking for help when I needed it. The security guard and the woman from the funnel cake stand showed me that most people are kind and want to help children who are in trouble. Learning to trust appropriate adults in emergency situations became an important life skill. From that day forward, my parents were much more vigilant about keeping track of me and my brother in crowded places. We developed a system where I had to check in with them every few minutes, and they made sure I knew our phone number and address in case I ever got separated from them again. But more than the practical safety lessons, that day taught me about the fierce, protective love that parents have for their children. Understanding how much my disappearance had frightened my mum and dad made me appreciate the security and love that surrounded me every day, even when I took it for granted. That story concludes there. Getting lost for 20 minutes taught the OP more about parental love than years of everyday family life ever could. Seeing the panic and relief in her parents' faces showed her just how precious she was to them, turning a scary experience into a profound lesson about family bonds. Sometimes we have to experience a moment of feeling unprotected to truly appreciate the safety net of love that usually surrounds us. Moving to a story about learning one of the most important workplace lessons we'll ever encounter, often through the frustration of feeling invisible despite our best efforts. The boss who ignored my efforts. I was 23 and working my first real job out of college at a mid-sized marketing company. I was eager to prove myself and convinced that hard work and dedication would naturally lead to recognition and advancement. I'd been raised to believe that if you just put your head down and did excellent work, success would follow automatically. My supervisor was a woman named Margaret who managed a team of 6 junior marketing associates. She had a reputation for being demanding but fair, and I was excited to learn from someone with her experience and track record. I was determined to be the best employee she'd ever had, the kind of employee she could count on, someone who went above and beyond expectations consistently. From my very first week, I threw myself into every project with complete enthusiasm. I'd stay late to polish presentations until they were perfect, volunteer for additional assignments that other people didn't want, and research industry trends on my own time to bring fresh ideas to our campaigns. I was genuinely passionate about the work and wanted to contribute meaningfully to our team's success. For the first few months, I kept expecting Margaret to notice my extra efforts and dedication. I'd submit reports that were more thorough than required, offer creative solutions during brainstorming sessions, and consistently meet every deadline ahead of schedule. I was putting in probably 50-hour weeks while my colleagues were working standard 40-hour schedules, but weeks turned into months, and Margaret never acknowledged my additional contributions. During team meetings, she'd praise other employees for work that seemed less comprehensive than what I was producing. She'd assign high-visibility projects to colleagues who had been there longer, even when I'd expressed interest and had relevant experience. The breaking point came during our quarterly performance reviews. I went into that meeting confident that Margaret would recognise the exceptional effort I'd been putting in and perhaps discuss opportunities for advancement or increased responsibility. I had prepared examples of projects where I'd exceeded expectations and initiatives I'd taken to improve our team's processes. Instead, Margaret gave me what amounted to a completely average review. She acknowledged that my work was solid and dependable, but there was no mention of the countless extra hours I'd invested or the additional value I'd been trying to bring to every assignment. She rated me as meeting expectations in every category, with no recognition that I'd been consistently exceeding them. I left that meeting feeling completely deflated and confused. Had I been deluding myself about the quality of my work? Was everyone else really performing at the same level I was, making my efforts unremarkable? Or was Margaret just not paying attention to the individual contributions of her team members? Over the next few weeks, I started observing my colleagues more carefully, trying to understand what I might be missing. What I discovered was that the people who seemed to get Margaret's attention weren't necessarily the ones doing the best work. They were the ones who made sure Margaret knew about every contribution they made. My colleague James, who consistently received praise and interesting assignments, had a habit of sending Margaret detailed emails about his progress on projects. He'd schedule brief check-in meetings to discuss challenges he was facing and ideas he was developing. He made sure Margaret was aware of every extra effort he put in, not in a boastful way, but as part of regular communication about his work. Another colleague, Sarah, had developed a relationship with Margaret that extended beyond just work assignments. They'd chat about weekend plans, share articles they found interesting, and Sarah would often ask Margaret for career advice. Margaret clearly saw Sarah as someone with potential and gave her opportunities to work on more strategic projects. I realised I'd been making a fundamental mistake in assuming that excellent work would speak for itself. While I'd been quietly exceeding expectations and hoping Margaret would notice, my colleagues had been actively managing their relationships with her and making sure their contributions were visible and understood. This was a painful lesson because it meant acknowledging that workplace success isn't just about merit and hard work. It's also about communication, relationship building, and making sure the right people are aware of your value. I'd been operating under a naive assumption that effort alone would be rewarded, without understanding the importance of advocacy and visibility. I started changing my approach immediately. I began sending Margaret weekly updates about my projects, highlighting challenges I'd solved and results I'd achieved. I scheduled occasional one-on-one meetings to discuss my professional development and seek feedback on my performance. I made sure to contribute meaningfully to team discussions and follow up on ideas I'd shared during meetings. Within a few months, Margaret's perception of me began to shift. She started assigning me more interesting projects and including me in strategic conversations I'd been excluded from before. During my next performance review, she acknowledged the high quality of my work and discussed possibilities for advancement within the company. But the most important lesson wasn't about managing up or workplace politics. It was about learning to find validation internally rather than depending on external recognition for my sense of professional worth. I realised I'd been measuring my success entirely by whether Margaret noticed and praised my efforts, which gave her too much power over my job satisfaction and self-esteem. I learned to take pride in the quality of my work, regardless of whether anyone else acknowledged it. When I completed a project I was proud of, I celebrated that accomplishment privately before worrying about whether my supervisor would recognise it. I started keeping a personal record of my achievements and contributions, not for performance reviews, but for my own sense of professional growth and competence. This shift in mindset made me more resilient and confident in subsequent jobs. I continued to work hard and strive for excellence, but I wasn't devastated when supervisors didn't immediately notice or praise my efforts. I understood that recognition was nice when it happened, but it wasn't the primary measure of whether I was doing valuable work. Years later, when I became a manager myself, I made sure to pay attention to all my team members, not just the ones who were most vocal about their contributions. I remembered how invisible I'd felt during those early months with Margaret, and I tried to create an environment where excellent work was noticed and acknowledged, regardless of how much self-promotion accompanied it. That experience with Margaret taught me that workplace dynamics are more complex than I'd initially understood, but it also showed me the importance of finding internal motivation and satisfaction in my professional life. Learning not to rely entirely on external validation for my sense of worth became one of the most valuable career lessons I ever learned. That story ends there. Sometimes the most valuable professional lessons come from feeling overlooked rather than celebrated. That OP learned that excellent work doesn't always speak for itself, but more importantly, they discovered the power of internal validation and taking genuine pride in their contributions, regardless of recognition. Margaret unknowingly taught them resilience and self-advocacy, skills that served them well throughout their entire career. Let's move to a story about academic failure and how sometimes the classes that nearly break us end up teaching us the most about perseverance and humility. The class I nearly failed. I was a junior in college and had always been a pretty solid student, not brilliant, but consistent enough to maintain a decent GPA and stay on track for graduation. I'd never failed a class or even come close, so when I registered for organic chemistry, I figured it would be challenging but manageable, like every other course I'd taken. I'd heard upperclassmen joke about organic chemistry being a weed-out class, designed to separate serious pre-med students from those who weren't cut out for medical school. But I wasn't even pre-med. I was a biology major planning to go into environmental science, so I assumed the horror stories didn't really apply to me. The trouble started from the very first lecture. Professor Williams began explaining molecular structures and reaction mechanisms at a pace that left me completely lost within 20 minutes. While other students were taking notes and nodding along, I was staring at the whiteboard trying to understand what language he was speaking. I told myself it was just first day jitters and that things would make more sense once I had time to review the material at home. But when I opened my textbook that evening, the concepts seemed even more confusing than they had during lecture. The diagrams looked like abstract art, and the chemical equations might as well have been written in hieroglyphics. Week after week, I fell further behind. Each new topic built on previous concepts that I hadn't mastered, creating this snowball effect where my confusion compounded daily. I'd spend hours reading the same chapter over and over, watching online tutorials, and trying to make sense of practice problems, but nothing seemed to stick. The first exam was a disaster. I walked out of that classroom knowing I'd failed before the professor even graded it. When I got my paper back with a large red 34 written at the top, I wasn't surprised, but I was devastated. I'd never seen a grade that low with my name on it, and I had no idea how to recover from such a catastrophic failure. I considered dropping the class, but it was too late in the semester to withdraw without academic penalty. I was stuck with organic chemistry whether I understood it or not. My academic advisor suggested I focus on damage control, trying to pass with the minimum possible grade to avoid having to retake the entire course. But something about that advice made me angry. I'd never been the kind of person who just gave up when things got difficult, and I didn't want to start now. Instead of accepting failure, I decided to completely change my approach to studying and learning. I started going to every single office hour that Professor Williams offered, even when I didn't have specific questions prepared. I'd sit in his office and work through practice problems while he was available to explain concepts I was struggling with. At first, he seemed surprised that someone who was failing so badly would invest so much time in office hours, but he was patient and helpful. I formed a study group with 3 other students who were also struggling with the material. We'd meet twice a week to work through homework assignments together and quiz each other on upcoming exams. Having other people to struggle with made the experience feel less isolating and hopeless. Most importantly, I learned to ask for help instead of trying to figure everything out independently. I'd always prided myself on being self-reliant academically, but organic chemistry taught me that some subjects require guidance and explanation from people who understand them better than you do. I started working with a tutor from the chemistry department's peer tutoring program. She was a senior who had excelled in organic chemistry and could explain concepts in ways that finally made sense to my brain. She helped me understand that chemistry wasn't just memorization. It was about recognizing patterns and understanding the logic behind molecular behavior. Slowly, painfully, things began to click. The molecular structures started looking less random and more predictable. I could begin to see why certain reactions happened and others didn't. My homework scores improved gradually, and I started feeling cautiously optimistic about the possibility of actually passing the class. The second exam was still rough, but I scored a 58, which felt like a massive victory after my initial 34. The third exam earned me a 72, and by the final exam, I managed to score an 81. My final grade in the class was a C-, barely passing but officially successful. That C- was one of the grades I was most proud of in my entire college career. It represented months of struggling, learning to ask for help, developing new study strategies, and refusing to give up when everything felt impossible. It taught me more about perseverance and resilience than any A I'd ever earned in easier classes. Organic chemistry showed me that intelligence isn't just about naturally understanding material quickly. It's also about persistence, adaptability, and the willingness to approach problems from multiple angles until something works. I learned that struggling with the subject doesn't mean you're not smart enough for it. It might just mean you need to find different ways to learn and understand. The experience completely changed my approach to challenging situations, both academic and personal. When I encountered difficult concepts in later classes or faced obstacles in my career, I remembered the lessons I'd learned from nearly failing organic chemistry. I knew that initial confusion didn't mean permanent failure, and that most problems could be solved with enough effort and the right kind of help. Looking back, I'm grateful that I nearly failed that class. It taught me humility about my own abilities and showed me the value of struggle in the learning process. Easy success doesn't build character or teach you much about your own capabilities. It's the classes that nearly break you that show you what you're really made of. That story concludes there. Nearly failing organic chemistry taught that OP more about learning and resilience than any easy class ever could. Sometimes our greatest academic disasters become our most valuable educational experiences, showing us that struggle and confusion are often just the first steps toward genuine understanding. That C- represented a level of personal growth that no A+ could match. Our next story takes us back to the simple power of human kindness and how sometimes a stranger's guidance can remind us that most people want to help when they see someone in need. The time a stranger gave me directions. I was 20 years old and visiting Chicago for the first time. I'd gotten a summer internship at a non-profit downtown, and I'd decided to take the train from the suburbs instead of trying to navigate city traffic in my old Honda Civic. I thought I'd figured out the public transportation system from studying maps online, but the reality of navigating an unfamiliar city was much more overwhelming than I'd anticipated. My first day of work was on a Monday morning, and I'd given myself what I thought was plenty of extra time to account for getting lost or confused. I'd taken the train into the city without any problems, but when I emerged from Union Station into downtown Chicago, I realized I had absolutely no idea which direction to walk. The address I'd been given was supposed to be only 6 blocks away, but standing on the busy sidewalk, surrounded by towering buildings, every direction looked exactly the same to me. I pulled out the printed map I'd brought, but trying to orient myself using a piece of paper while people rushed past me on all sides was proving impossible. I started walking in what I hoped was the right direction, checking street signs and trying to match them to my map. But after 15 minutes of wandering, I was completely lost and starting to panic. My phone battery was nearly dead, so I couldn't use GPS, and I was supposed to be at work in 20 minutes. I was standing on a corner looking completely confused when this older man in a business suit walked up to me and asked if I needed help finding something. I must have looked as lost as I felt, because he had this patient, understanding expression that immediately made me feel less panicked. I showed him the address on my paperwork, and he nodded knowingly. He told me the building was actually pretty tricky to find if you weren't familiar with the area, and that he'd seen plenty of people standing on that same corner looking confused. Instead of just pointing me in the right direction, he offered to walk me there, since he was heading that way anyway. As we walked, he told me about his own first day working downtown, 25 years earlier. He'd gotten so lost that he'd shown up an hour late to his first job, and was convinced he'd be fired before he even started. His boss had been understanding, and he'd made it a point ever since to help other people who looked like they were having the same experience he'd had. He walked me all the way to the front door of my building, wished me luck on my first day, and disappeared back into the crowd before I could properly thank him. I made it to my internship with 5 minutes to spare, feeling grateful and oddly calm despite the stressful start to my morning. That brief interaction with a complete stranger taught me something important about how we move through the world together. He could have easily ignored me or just pointed me in the right direction, but instead, he took time out of his own morning commute to make sure I actually made it where I needed to go. Throughout that summer in Chicago, I tried to pay forward the kindness that stranger had shown me. When I saw tourists looking confused on the train, I'd offer directions or suggest which stop they needed. When new interns started at my office, I'd remember how overwhelming that first day could be and try to make them feel welcome, but the lesson went deeper than just helping people with directions. That man showed me that small acts of generosity don't cost much but can completely change someone's experience of a difficult moment. His willingness to walk an extra few blocks turned what could have been a disaster into a manageable challenge. Years later, I still think about that stranger whenever I see someone who looks lost or confused. Taking a few minutes to help doesn't require any special skills or resources, just the awareness that we all struggle sometimes and the willingness to offer assistance when we can. That story ends there. One stranger's kindness turned a potentially terrible first day into a reminder that most people genuinely want to help when they see someone struggling. It's amazing how walking someone to their destination can teach them a lifetime lesson about paying it forward. Small gestures of help ripple outward in ways we never expect. Let's move on to a story about money and independence, and how sometimes The smallest paychecks teach us the biggest lessons about self-reliance. The day I got my first paycheck. I was 16 and had been working at the local grocery store for 2 weeks, bagging groceries and collecting shopping carts from the parking lot. It wasn't glamorous work by any stretch, but it was my first real job, and I was excited to finally have some income of my own. I'd grown up in a family where money was always tight, not because my parents were irresponsible, but because raising 3 kids on 2 modest incomes didn't leave much room for extras. I'd watched my friends get spending money from their parents for movies or new clothes, while I had to carefully save birthday and Christmas money for anything beyond basic necessities. Getting that job felt like the first step toward independence. I'd filled out the application myself, gone through the interview process, and convinced the manager to hire me despite having 0 work experience. For the first time in my life, I was going to earn money through my own effort rather than depending on my parents or waiting for special occasions. My first 2 weeks on the job were a learning curve. I had to figure out how to bag groceries efficiently without crushing the bread or putting heavy items on top of delicate ones. I learned to navigate the parking lot safely while pushing long trains of shopping carts, and I mastered the art of staying polite with difficult customers even when they were having bad days. The work wasn't particularly challenging, but it required showing up consistently and maintaining a good attitude for entire shifts. Some days I was exhausted from school and would rather have gone home to watch TV, but I'd committed to this job and wanted to prove I could handle the responsibility. When payday finally arrived, my supervisor handed me an envelope with my name written on it in careful handwriting. I waited until my break to open it, wanting to savor the moment of receiving my very first paycheck. When I tore open that envelope and saw the check inside, I was simultaneously thrilled and slightly disappointed. The amount was smaller than I'd expected after taxes and deductions were taken out. 2 weeks of work had earned me $127.50, which seemed like both a fortune and hardly anything at the same time. But holding that piece of paper with my name on it felt incredibly significant in a way I hadn't anticipated. This wasn't money that had been given to me as a gift or allowance. This was money I had earned through my own labour, time, and effort. Every dollar represented hours of bagging groceries, gathering shopping carts, and being helpful to customers. It was the tangible result of my own work ethic and reliability. I took that check to the bank the next day and deposited it into my very first checking account. Watching the teller process the transaction and hand me a receipt showing my new balance gave me this incredible sense of accomplishment and independence. I had money that was entirely mine, earned through my own efforts. With my first paycheck, I bought myself something I'd been wanting for months, a CD by my favourite band that cost $15.99. It might seem like a small purchase, but paying for it with money I'd earned myself made it feel special in a way that gifts never had. I'd chosen to work for this music, and that made listening to it more meaningful. But the real lesson wasn't about the money itself. It was about understanding the relationship between effort and reward, between time invested and independence gained. That first paycheck taught me that financial freedom starts with being willing to work for what you want, instead of waiting for someone else to provide it. Over the next few months, as I continued working at the grocery store, I learned to budget my small paychecks carefully. I'd set aside money for things I needed, save some for bigger purchases I was planning, and allow myself a small amount for entertainment or treats. Managing my own income, even a modest one, taught me financial responsibility in ways that allowances never could have. The job also taught me to appreciate money differently. When you've spent 4 hours collecting shopping carts in the rain to earn $30, you think twice about spending that money carelessly. I became much more intentional about purchases, considering whether something was worth the hours of work it represented. That first paycheck marks the beginning of my understanding that independence isn't just about age or freedom from rules. It's about developing the ability to support yourself and make your own choices about how to spend the resources you've earned. Even at 16, earning $127.50 every 2 weeks gave me a taste of what it would feel like to be truly self-sufficient. Years later, when I earned my first salary from a professional job, I remembered the pride I'd felt holding that grocery store paycheck. The amount was much larger, but the satisfaction of earning money through my own work remained fundamentally the same. That first job taught me that there's dignity in any honest work, and that financial independence begins with the willingness to earn your own way. That story ends there. Sometimes the smallest paychecks teach us the biggest lessons about self-reliance and the value of work. That $127.50 represented something much more valuable than money. It was the OP's first taste of independence and the pride that comes from earning your own way. Those early lessons about effort and reward shape how we approach money for the rest of our lives. Moving on to a story about finding joy in the most unexpected circumstances, and how sometimes losing our modern conveniences reminds us of what really matters. The storm that knocked the power out. I was 12 years old when Hurricane Isabel hit our area and knocked out electricity for nearly a week. At first, losing power seemed like the worst possible disaster that could happen to our family. No TV, no video games, no air conditioning, and worst of all, no way to reheat the leftover pizza in our refrigerator. My parents had been tracking the storm for days, stocking up on batteries, candles, and non-perishable food. They'd explained that we might lose power for a day or two, but I don't think any of us were prepared for how different our daily routine would become when all our electronic entertainment disappeared overnight. The first day without power was miserable. My younger sister and I kept flipping light switches out of habit, forgetting that nothing would happen. We'd walk over to the TV and stare at the black screen, trying to remember what we used to do before we could watch cartoons whenever we wanted. The house felt strangely quiet without the constant hum of appliances and electronics. By the second day, our complaining had reached epic levels. We were bored, hot, and convinced that life would never return to normal. My parents were trying to stay positive, but I could tell they were getting frustrated with our constant whining about having nothing to do. That evening, as we sat around the kitchen table eating sandwiches by candlelight, my dad suggested we play a board game. We'd had these games for years, stored in the hall closet and mostly forgotten, but with no other options, we reluctantly agreed to try Monopoly. Something magical happened during that game. Without the distraction of screens or background noise, we actually talked to each other in ways we hadn't in months. My sister, who was usually glued to her Game Boy, was cracking jokes and making deals with a creativity I'd never seen before. My parents were relaxed and playful, not worried about work emails or news updates they couldn't access anyway. The game lasted for hours, much longer than Monopoly usually takes, because we kept getting distracted by conversations and laughter. We told stories, shared memories, and discovered things about each other that had somehow never come up during our regular dinner table conversations. When we finally finished playing, nobody wanted to go to bed. My mum suggested we make hot chocolate on our gas stove, and we sat in the living room drinking it by candlelight, playing 20 questions and telling ghost stories. The house felt cozy and intimate in a way it never did when every room was brightly lit. The next few days developed their own rhythm. We'd wake up with the sun instead of alarm clocks, eat simple meals that didn't require heating, and spend our days reading books, playing cards, and having conversations that lasted for hours. My sister and I rediscovered board games we'd forgotten we owned and invented new games, using dice and playing cards. We also started helping each other in ways we hadn't before. Since we couldn't just disappear into our separate rooms with our individual entertainment, we were stuck together as a family unit. My sister and I actually started getting along better because we had to cooperate to have any fun at all. My parents seemed different too, more present and relaxed than they'd been in a long time. Without work emails or news updates constantly demanding their attention, they could focus entirely on our family time. My dad taught us card games he'd learned as a kid, and my mum showed us how to make shadow puppets on the wall with flashlight beams. When the power finally came back on after 6 days, we were almost disappointed. The house suddenly felt bright and noisy after we'd gotten used to the gentle glow of candles and oil lamps. The return of television and video games seemed less exciting than it should have after we'd discovered how much fun we could have with just each other's company. That week without electricity taught our family something important about presence and connection. We realised how much our electronic devices had been isolating us from each other, even when we were all in the same house. Without screens to stare at, we'd had no choice but to interact, and the result had been some of the best family time we'd ever had. From that point on, my parents instituted a weekly power outage night where we'd turn off all the electronics and spend the evening playing games or just talking. It never felt quite as natural as it had during the real storm, but it helped us maintain some of the closeness we'd discovered during those candlelit evenings. Years later, whenever I feel overwhelmed by technology or disconnected from the people I care about, I remember that week when Hurricane Isabel forced us to slow down and pay attention to each other. Sometimes losing the things we think we need most helps us discover what we actually value. That story ends there. A power outage that seemed like a disaster turned into a week of genuine family connection and joy. Sometimes we need to lose our modern distractions to remember how much happiness can come from simple conversations and board games by candlelight. That OP learned that presence and togetherness matter more than entertainment and convenience. Let's move to a story about friendship and the painful but necessary lesson that not all relationships are meant to last forever. The friend who drifted away. Sarah and I had been best friends since second grade, the kind of friendship where we finished each other's sentences and spent every possible moment together. We had sleepovers every weekend, shared all our secrets, and genuinely believed we'd be friends forever, no matter what life threw at us. Throughout elementary and middle school, we were inseparable. We'd walk to school together every morning, sit together at lunch, and spend our afternoons either at her house or mine. We had matching friendship bracelets, shared a love for the same books and movies, and could make each other laugh until our stomachs hurt. When high school started, we promised each other that nothing would change between us. We might make new friends or join different activities, but we'd always be each other's person. We even made plans for college, talking about how we'd room together and continue our friendship into adulthood. But high school did change things, slowly and in ways neither of us initially noticed. Sarah got really involved in theatre and started spending most of her time with kids from the drama club. I joined the debate team and found myself gravitating toward people who shared my interest in politics and current events. At first, we made an effort to stay connected, despite our different schedules. We'd text constantly throughout the day and try to hang out on weekends when we weren't busy with our respective activities. But gradually, our conversations became shorter and less frequent, and our weekend plans started getting cancelled for other commitments. I noticed that Sarah was changing in ways that felt foreign to me. She'd always been outgoing, but now she was dramatic in a way that seemed performative rather than genuine. She'd tell elaborate stories about theatre drama and use vocabulary and mannerisms that felt borrowed from the older kids she was spending time with. Meanwhile, I was probably changing too, becoming more serious and focused on academics than I'd been in middle school. The things that used to seem important to both of us, like gossiping about classmates or watching silly movies, started feeling juvenile and boring. By junior year, we were more like friendly acquaintances than best friends. We'd wave to each other in the hallways and make small talk when we ran into each other, but we weren't sharing our deepest thoughts or spending significant time together anymore. The final nail in the coffin came when we both started dating. Sarah's boyfriend was this intense theatre kid who seemed to think anyone not involved in drama was beneath his notice. My boyfriend was quiet and studious, more interested in books than performances. When we'd all hang out together, the conversations felt forced and awkward. By senior year, Sarah and I barely spoke, except for polite exchanges in classes we happened to share. We'd grown into different people with different interests, different friend groups and different priorities. The closeness we'd once shared felt like something from childhood that we'd outgrown. Graduation was especially weird because we'd always imagined walking across that stage together, celebrating the end of high school as best friends. Instead, we were cordial strangers who happened to have a shared history. We took a picture together at the graduation party, but it felt more like an obligation than a celebration of our friendship. I went to college 3 states away, and Sarah stayed local to attend a school with a strong theatre programme. We exchanged a few texts during our first semester, updating each other on college life. But even those conversations felt stilted and polite, rather than genuine. For a long time I felt guilty about letting our friendship fade. I wondered if I should have tried harder to maintain our connection, if I'd been too willing to let new interests and new friends take priority over our childhood bond. I felt like I'd failed at something important by not keeping Sarah in my life. But as I got older and formed new friendships in college and beyond, I started to understand that not all relationships are meant to last forever. Sarah and I had been perfect friends for each other during a specific period of our lives, but we'd grown in different directions as we figured out who we were as individuals. There was nothing wrong with either of us for changing, and there was nothing wrong with our friendship ending. We'd given each other exactly what we needed during our childhood years: loyalty, laughter, and the security of knowing someone understood and accepted us completely. I learned that some friendships are meant to be lifelong, while others serve their purpose during particular seasons and then naturally fade as people evolve. Both types of relationships are valuable, even if they end differently. Now, when I think about Sarah, I feel grateful for the years we shared rather than sad about the friendship we lost. She taught me what it meant to have a best friend, how to be loyal and supportive, and how to find joy in simple shared experiences. Those lessons shaped how I approach all my relationships, even though Sarah herself is no longer part of my life. That story ends there. Sometimes friendships that feel permanent are actually meant to be temporary, serving their purpose during specific seasons of growth. Sarah and the OP gave each other exactly what they needed during childhood, and growing apart didn't diminish the value of those formative years together. Learning to let go of relationships that have run their course is just as important as learning to maintain the ones that are meant to last. Moving to a story about harsh words that, while painful, became the motivation for proving someone wrong about your potential. The teacher who told me I wasn't good enough. Mrs. Henderson was my 8th grade English teacher, and she had a reputation for being tough but fair. I'd always been a decent student, not exceptional, but solid enough to maintain good grades and stay out of trouble. When I walked into her classroom that first day, I was expecting a challenging year, but nothing I couldn't handle. The problem started early in the semester, when we began working on creative writing assignments. I'd always enjoyed writing stories and had gotten positive feedback from previous teachers about my imagination and creativity. I was excited to have a class focused entirely on developing those skills, but Mrs. Henderson seemed unimpressed with everything I submitted. While she'd praise other students' work and offer encouraging feedback, my papers would come back covered in red ink with comments like unclear, needs work, and lacks focus. I started putting extra effort into my assignments, spending hours revising and polishing, but nothing seemed to meet her standards. The breaking point came when we had to write a short story for our midterm project. I'd worked on mine for weeks, crafting what I thought was an engaging plot with well-developed characters and descriptive language. I was genuinely proud of the story, and confident that Mrs. Henderson would finally see that I had potential as a writer. When she handed back our graded stories, mine had a large C- written at the top, along with a note asking me to see her after class. I was disappointed by the grade, but hoped that our private conversation would include some constructive feedback about how to improve. Instead, Mrs. Henderson looked at me across her desk and said something that I still remember, word for word, 15 years later. She told me that while I seemed like a nice enough student, I simply didn't have the natural talent for writing that some of my classmates possessed. She said I should consider focusing my energy on subjects that better matched my abilities. She wasn't being mean or cruel, just matter of fact in a way that somehow made her words more devastating. She suggested that I might be better suited for math or science, subjects that relied more on logic than creativity. She said that continuing to pursue writing would likely lead to frustration and disappointment. I left that conversation feeling completely deflated. Here was an adult whose job was to recognise and nurture student potential, and she'd essentially told me I didn't have any in the area I cared most about. I went home that day, questioning everything I'd believed about my own abilities and interests. For the rest of 8th grade, I did exactly what Mrs. Henderson had suggested. I put minimal effort into English assignments, accepting whatever grades I received, and focused my energy on math and science classes. I told myself that Mrs. Henderson was probably right, that I'd been deluding myself about having any real writing talent, but something about giving up on writing felt wrong, like I was abandoning an important part of myself. Even though I'd stopped putting effort into school assignments, I found myself writing stories in my spare time, creating characters and plots that excited me, even if no one else would ever see them. When high school started, I had a new English teacher who took a completely different approach to student development. Mr. Rodriguez focused on helping each student find their unique voice rather than comparing everyone to the same standard. When I hesitantly submitted my first creative writing assignment, he gave me feedback that was both honest and encouraging. He pointed out specific areas where my writing could improve, but he also highlighted strengths I didn't know I had. He said I had a natural ear for dialogue and an ability to create authentic characters that readers could connect with emotionally. His feedback gave me the confidence to start taking my writing seriously again. Throughout high school, I worked hard to develop my skills, joining the school newspaper and entering writing contests whenever possible. I didn't win every competition I entered, but I was improving steadily and gaining recognition for my work. By senior year, I was editor of the school literary magazine and had been accepted to college with a partial scholarship for writing. In college, I majored in journalism and continued developing my craft through internships and freelance work. I discovered that Mrs. Henderson had been wrong about my potential, but right about one thing. Writing did require hard work and persistence. The difference was that I was willing to put in that effort because I genuinely loved the process of creating stories and communicating ideas through words. After graduation, I found work as a staff writer for a local newspaper, covering everything from city council meetings to high school sports. It wasn't glamorous, but I was getting paid to write, something Mrs. Henderson had essentially told me would never happen. A few years later, I was covering a school board meeting when I saw Mrs. Henderson in the audience. She was still teaching 8th grade English and looked exactly the same as she had when I was her student. After the meeting, I approached her and reintroduced myself. She remembered me, though she seemed surprised to learn that I'd become a professional writer. I told her about my college experience and my current job, and she seemed genuinely pleased by my success. She said she was glad I'd proved her wrong, and that maybe she'd been too quick to judge my potential. I thanked her for that conversation we'd had in 8th grade, which confused her until I explained how her harsh assessment had motivated me to work harder and proved that she'd been wrong about my abilities. Sometimes, the people who doubt us end up giving us exactly the push we need to exceed our own expectations. That story ends there. Mrs. Henderson's crushing words became the fuel that drove that OP to prove her wrong about their potential. Sometimes, the people who tell us we're not good enough inadvertently give us the motivation to become better than we ever imagined possible. That harsh 8th grade assessment turned into a lifetime of determination to succeed as a writer. Let's move to a story about learning time management and work ethic through the exhausting but educational experience of juggling multiple responsibilities. The summer I worked 2 jobs. I was 19 and desperately needed money for my sophomore year of college. My financial aid covered tuition and basic expenses, but I wanted some cushion for emergencies and maybe enough left over to actually enjoy myself occasionally. When I couldn't find a single job that paid enough to meet my savings goals, I decided to take on 2 part-time positions simultaneously. My first job was at a local restaurant where I worked as a server during lunch and dinner shifts. The money was decent when tips were good, but the schedule was unpredictable and the work was physically demanding. I'd spend entire shifts on my feet, carrying heavy trays and dealing with difficult customers who seemed to think servers existed solely for their convenience. My second job was at a retail store in the mall, working mostly morning and early afternoon shifts, helping customers and managing inventory. The pay was lower than the restaurant, but the work was less stressful and the hours were more consistent. The challenge was that both jobs wanted maximum availability from their employees, not understanding that I was trying to balance 2 different schedules. For the first few weeks, I thought I could handle the workload without any major problems. I'd work at the store from 8 to 2, grab a quick lunch, and then head to the restaurant for the dinner shift. On busy days, I might work from 8 in the morning until 11 at night, with only brief breaks between jobs. The exhaustion hit me harder than I'd expected. I dragged myself home after 16-hour days, barely able to stay awake long enough to set my alarm for the next morning. I was constantly tired, running on coffee and adrenaline and making silly mistakes at both jobs because I couldn't focus properly. But I was also learning valuable lessons about time management and efficiency. When you only have 30 minutes between jobs to eat lunch and change clothes, you become incredibly good at prioritizing what's actually important. I learned to prepare everything the night before, laying out uniforms and packing meals so I wouldn't waste time in the morning. I also discovered that I was capable of much more than I'd thought. There were days when I genuinely didn't think I could handle another demanding customer or carry another heavy tray, but I'd push through anyway because I needed the money. I was building physical and mental stamina I didn't know I possessed. The real challenge came when both jobs scheduled me for the same time slots. The restaurant would need extra help during a busy weekend, while the retail store would want me to work a special sale event. I'd have to negotiate with both managers, sometimes trading shifts with other employees, or finding creative solutions to avoid letting either employer down. These scheduling conflicts taught me important lessons about communication and problem solving under pressure. I learned to be proactive about potential conflicts, checking both schedules carefully and addressing problems before they became crises. I became skilled at finding win-win solutions that satisfied both employers while protecting my own interests. By midsummer, I'd developed a routine that maximized my earnings while minimizing wasted time and energy. I'd batch similar tasks together, like running all my errands on the same day or doing laundry while meal prepping for the week. Every minute had to count when I was working 60+ hours a week. The money was adding up faster than I'd expected, but so was the physical toll. I was losing weight because I rarely had time to eat proper meals, surviving on granola bars and whatever quick food I could grab between shifts. My social life had completely disappeared since I was working every day of the week and too tired for activities when I wasn't. The breaking point came during a particularly brutal week in July when both jobs had major events happening simultaneously. The restaurant was catering a wedding reception that required all hands on deck, while the retail store was having their biggest sale of the summer. I ended up working 19 days straight without a single day off. By the end of that stretch, I was making mistakes that could have gotten me fired from either job. I served the wrong orders to customers, miscounted inventory at the store, and generally felt like I was moving through fog. I realized I was pushing myself beyond reasonable limits and needed to make some adjustments. I had an honest conversation with both managers about my situation and my need for at least one day off per week. To my surprise, both were understanding and willing to work with me on scheduling. They'd noticed my work quality slipping and were concerned about burnout affecting my performance. The final month of summer was more manageable with proper rest built into my schedule. I still worked long hours and earned good money, but I had enough recovery time to maintain the quality of work both employers expected. I learned that sustainability matters more than maximum effort when you're trying to maintain multiple commitments long term. When I calculated my total earnings at the end of the summer, I'd saved more money than I'd ever had in my life. But more valuable than the money were the skills I'd developed in time management, communication, and pushing through difficult situations when quitting wasn't an option. That summer taught me that I could handle much more responsibility and pressure than I'd thought possible. It also showed me the importance of setting boundaries and taking care of myself, even when external demands felt overwhelming. Those lessons about balancing multiple priorities served me well throughout college and into my professional career. Working 2 jobs simultaneously was exhausting and stressful, but it gave me confidence in my ability to handle challenging situations and achieve ambitious goals through sustained effort. I learned that most limitations are self-imposed and that pushing beyond your comfort zone can reveal capabilities you didn't know you had. That story ends there. Working 2 jobs pushed that OP to their absolute limits, but taught them invaluable lessons about time management and their own resilience. Sometimes we don't know what we're capable of until circumstances force us to discover our true potential. That exhausting summer became the foundation for handling multiple priorities throughout their adult life. Moving on to a story about sibling relationships and how annoying childhood behaviours can actually be expressions of love and connection. The sibling who always borrowed my stuff. My younger brother Danny was 3 years younger than me and had this infuriating habit of taking my belongings without asking. He'd wear my favourite shirts to school, use my art supplies for his projects, and somehow always manage to lose or damage whatever he'd borrowed. Throughout our childhood, this was a constant source of conflict between us. I'd come home from school excited to wear a particular shirt, only to find Danny had already claimed it and gotten it dirty during recess. Or I'd sit down to work on homework and discover that half my pens were missing because Danny had taken them for some project and forgotten to return them. My parents' approach to this situation was frustrating in its own way. They'd tell me that sharing was important and that I should be more generous with my little brother. When I'd complain about Danny taking my things, they'd suggest that maybe I should be flattered that he wanted to be like his big sister. But it didn't feel flattering when I couldn't find my favourite book because Danny had taken it to read during lunch, or when my carefully organised desk supplies would be scattered throughout the house, because he'd borrowed them for various activities. I felt like I had no personal space or belongings that were truly mine. The worst incident happened when I was in 7th grade and had saved up money from my allowance to buy this special sketchbook with really nice paper. I'd been planning an art project for weeks and was excited to finally have professional quality materials to work with. The day after I bought it, I found Danny in his room using my expensive sketchbook as scratch paper for math homework. I completely lost it and yelled at him in a way that made him cry, which brought our parents running. They made me apologise for being mean to Danny, but they also had a conversation with him about asking permission before taking other people's belongings. I thought the problem was finally solved, but Danny kept borrowing my stuff, just more sneakily than before. He'd wait until I was at friends' houses or take things he thought I wouldn't notice were missing. The behaviour continued through middle school and into high school, though it evolved as we got older. By high school, instead of taking my art supplies, Danny would borrow my CDs or wear my jackets without asking. He'd use my computer when I wasn't home and somehow always managed to mess up my carefully organised files. I'd gotten used to checking my room for missing items whenever Danny seemed to be wearing something that looked familiar. The dynamic between us started changing when I left for college. Suddenly, Danny couldn't borrow my stuff anymore because I wasn't living at home. When I'd come back for visits, I noticed he seemed different around me, more distant and less likely to initiate conversations or want to hang out together. During one winter break, I found Danny in my old room going through boxes of belongings I'd left behind when I moved to college. He wasn't taking anything, just looking through my old books and art projects. When he saw me in the doorway, he looked embarrassed and started to leave. I asked him what he was doing, and after some prodding, he admitted that he missed having me around the house. He said everything felt different without me there to borrow things from. That's when I realised something I'd never understood during all those years of conflict. Danny hadn't been taking my stuff because he was inconsiderate or trying to annoy me. He'd been borrowing my belongings because he wanted to feel connected to me, to have some piece of his big sister's world that he could participate in. When he wore my shirts or used my art supplies, he was trying to be closer to someone he looked up to. All those times he'd stolen my things, he'd actually been expressing love and admiration in the only way he knew how. He wanted to be like me, to share in my interests and activities, and taking my belongings was his way of participating in my life. I started leaving some of my old books and art supplies in my room when I'd go back to college, telling Danny he could use them whenever he wanted. I also made an effort to include him more deliberately in activities when I was home for visits, recognizing that his borrowing had been a request for attention and connection. Our relationship improved dramatically once I understood the motivation behind his behavior. Instead of seeing him as the annoying little brother who couldn't respect boundaries, I started appreciating him as someone who had always wanted to be close to me, but hadn't known how to express that need appropriately. Now that we're both adults, Danny and I have a great relationship built on mutual respect and genuine friendship. He still occasionally borrows my things when we're visiting our parents' house, but now he asks first. And when he does, I usually say yes because I understand that sharing belongings has always been one of the ways we show love for each other. Looking back, I wish I'd been more generous and understanding during our childhood. Danny's borrowing was irritating, but it came from a place of love and admiration that I was too young and self-centered to recognize at the time. That story ends there. What felt like constant theft was actually a little brother's way of staying connected to the sister he admired. Danny's borrowing was his clumsy attempt at closeness, an understanding that motivation completely transformed their relationship. Sometimes, the most annoying childhood behaviors are actually expressions of love that we're too young to recognize. Let's move to a story about personal growth and the liberating moment when you finally learn to prioritize your own needs over everyone else's expectations. The day I finally said no. I'd been a people pleaser my entire life, the kind of person who would agree to anything to avoid disappointing others or causing conflict. If someone needed a favor, I'd drop whatever I was doing to help. If friends wanted to make plans that didn't interest me, I'd go along anyway to keep everyone happy. This pattern had been developing since childhood, where I'd learned that being agreeable and helpful earned praise and approval from adults. Teachers loved me because I'd volunteer for extra work. My parents bragged about having such a responsible, accommodating daughter. Friends could always count on me to go along with whatever they wanted to do. But by my mid-20s, this constant agreement was exhausting me. I was spending my weekends helping friends move or attending events I didn't enjoy. I was taking on extra projects at work because I couldn't say no when supervisors asked for volunteers. I was dating people I wasn't really interested in because saying no to second dates felt mean. The breaking point came on a Saturday when I already had plans to spend the day alone, something I rarely allowed myself to do. I'd been looking forward to sleeping in, reading a book I'd been trying to finish for weeks, and just having some quiet time to recharge my social batteries. That morning, my friend Jessica called, asking if I could help her paint her new apartment. She said her other friends had cancelled last minute, and she really needed someone to help her get it done before her furniture arrived on Monday. My immediate instinct was to say yes, even though it meant giving up the peaceful day I'd been planning. I found myself starting to agree when something inside me just rebelled. For the first time in my adult life, I heard myself saying, "I can't help you today, Jessica. I already have plans." The words felt foreign coming out of my mouth, but also strangely liberating. Jessica seemed surprised by my response and pushed a little, asking what plans could be more important than helping a friend in need. The old me would have caved immediately and made up some excuse about why my plans weren't really that important. Instead, I simply repeated that I wasn't available that day. After I hung up the phone, I felt a mixture of guilt and relief that was completely new to me. I felt bad about disappointing Jessica, but I also felt proud of myself for protecting my own time and energy. For once, I was prioritizing my own needs over someone else's expectations. I spent that Saturday exactly as I'd planned, reading my book and enjoying the rare luxury of having no obligations to anyone else. It was one of the most relaxing days I'd had in months, and it made me realize how much I'd been neglecting my own well-being by always saying yes to others. The next week, I had another opportunity to practice setting boundaries when my boss asked if I could work late to help finish a project that wasn't my responsibility. Instead of automatically agreeing like I always had before, I took a moment to consider whether this was something I actually wanted or needed to do. I realized that staying late would mean missing dinner with my family, something I genuinely cared more about than earning extra credit at work for a project that wouldn't benefit my career. I told my boss I had prior commitments, but would be happy to help find alternative solutions during regular work hours. Each time I said no to something I didn't want to do, it became slightly easier to do it again. I learned that most people respected my boundaries once I started setting them clearly. The friends who truly cared about me understood when I wasn't available, and the ones who got angry about my refusal to always accommodate them revealed themselves as people who had been taking advantage of my people-pleasing tendencies. Setting boundaries also improved the quality of my relationships because I was no longer resentful about activities I'd agreed to do reluctantly. When I said yes to plans, it was because I genuinely wanted to participate, which made me a more enthusiastic and present friend. At work, saying no to excessive demands actually increased my supervisor's respect for my time and expertise. Instead of seeing me as someone who would take on anything, they started viewing me as someone whose agreement meant the project was genuinely important. Learning to say no also helped me identify what I actually wanted to do with my time and energy. When I stopped automatically filling my schedule with other people's priorities, I had space to pursue interests and activities that genuinely excited me. That first no to Jessica was terrifying because I'd never prioritized my own needs so directly before. But it taught me that setting boundaries isn't selfish or mean. It's necessary for maintaining healthy relationships and personal well-being. Now I'm much more selective about the commitments I make, and as a result, I'm more reliable and enthusiastic about the ones I do accept. Learning to say no taught me that my time and energy are valuable resources that deserve to be protected and used intentionally. That story concludes there. Learning to say no was this OP's first step toward reclaiming their own life from the constant demands of others. That simple word became the foundation for healthier relationships and genuine self-respect. Sometimes we get so used to being treated poorly that we forget we deserve better. The OP finally learned that love shouldn't come at the cost of your self-respect, and walking away from that toxic situation was the bravest thing they could have done. It's heartbreaking how long it took them to realize their own worth, but at least they got there before it was too late. That relationship may have broken them temporarily, but it rebuilt them into someone who knows their value. Our next story takes us to one of those jobs that nobody wants, but everybody needs to experience at least once in their life. The job I hated that made me appreciate work. I was 17 and needed money for gas and the occasional movie with friends. My options in our small town were pretty limited: McDonald's, Subway, or the local grocery store. I figured flipping burgers couldn't be that hard, so I walked into McDonald's on a Tuesday afternoon and somehow walked out with a job starting that weekend. My first shift was the breakfast rush on a Saturday morning. I thought I understood what busy meant, but nothing could have prepared me for the chaos that starts at 6 a.m. when people need their coffee and Egg McMuffins before work. The manager, Carlos, threw me on the grill after about 10 minutes of training, which basically consisted of don't burn yourself and don't burn the food. The heat was the first thing that nearly broke me. Even with the industrial fans running constantly, The area around the grill felt like standing inside an oven. By 7 a.m, my uniform was completely soaked with sweat, and I had 6 more hours left on my shift. The smell of grease and cooking meat embedded itself in my clothes and hair so deeply that I could still smell it hours after getting home. But the real challenge wasn't the physical discomfort, it was the pace. Orders were flying in faster than I could process them. Carlos would shout instructions about how many patties to drop, when to flip them, and which orders were priority, all while I was trying not to burn myself on the hot surfaces surrounding me. I made mistakes constantly during those first few weeks, overcooking burgers, forgetting to add pickles, mixing up orders during the lunch rush. The customers were a whole other education. There was the businessman who came through drive-through every morning at exactly 7:23 a.m. and wanted his coffee made perfectly, or he'd make the entire staff start over. The soccer mum who would order 10 different meals with specific modifications for her kids, then act like we were incompetent when it took more than 3 minutes to prepare. The teenager who would pay for a $5 meal, entirely in quarters and dimes, while a line of cars waited behind him. But there were also the regulars who made the job bearable. The elderly man who came in every Tuesday and Thursday, always ordered the same fish sandwich, and would tell us stories about his grandchildren. The construction worker who would leave dollar tips even though we weren't supposed to accept them, saying he remembered what it was like to work for minimum wage. The single mum who would bring her 2 kids in for Happy Meals every Friday night as their weekly treat, and always said thank you like we'd done something special for her family. Carlos taught me things about work that I didn't expect to learn from a fast food job. He showed me that every task, no matter how simple it seemed, required skill and attention to detail. Cooking burgers consistently meant understanding timing and temperature. Taking orders accurately meant listening carefully and asking the right questions. Managing the lunch rush meant anticipating problems and working as part of a team where everyone's performance affected everyone else. The hardest lesson was learning to keep working when I was exhausted, frustrated, or dealing with difficult people. There were days when I wanted to walk out during my shift, especially when customers were particularly rude or when we were short-staffed and everyone was stressed. But Carlos would remind me that showing up and doing your job well, even when it's hard, is what separates reliable employees from people who don't last. I also learned about money in ways I'd never understood before. Every dollar I earned represented time spent in that hot kitchen, dealing with difficult customers and pushing through exhaustion. When I wanted to buy something, I'd calculate how many hours of work it represented. A $20 shirt meant almost 3 hours of taking orders and cleaning tables. That perspective made me much more thoughtful about spending money I'd earned through real effort. The job taught me to respect service workers in ways I'd never considered before. I started noticing how hard restaurant employees worked, how much skill it took to manage multiple tasks under pressure, and how much patience was required to deal with the public all day. I began tipping better and treating workers with more consideration because I understood what they were going through. By the end of the summer, I'd developed skills I didn't know I was learning. I could multitask under pressure, stay calm when people were yelling at me, and work efficiently as part of a team. I could manage my time better and had developed a work ethic that served me well in later jobs. Most importantly, I'd learned that there's dignity in any honest work, and that the people doing these jobs deserve respect and decent treatment. When I started college that fall, I had a completely different attitude toward work and money. I couldn't spend carelessly anymore because I knew exactly how much effort went into earning each dollar. I also had confidence that I could handle difficult situations and demanding supervisors because I'd already proven to myself that I could succeed in a challenging work environment. That McDonald's job was miserable in a lot of ways, but it gave me a foundation for understanding what real work looks like. It taught me that showing up consistently, doing your best, even when it's hard, and treating people with respect are skills that matter in any career. Those lessons have stayed with me through every job I've had since, and I'm grateful I learned them early by flipping burgers in a hot kitchen for minimum wage. That story ends there. Sometimes the worst jobs teach us the best lessons about work ethic and respect. That OP learned more about real life from 3 months behind a McDonald's grill than most people learn in years of easier positions. There's something to be said for jobs that force you to develop character under pressure, even when you hate every minute of it. Moving on to a story about failure and how sometimes embarrassing ourselves is exactly what we need to actually improve. The time I failed my driving test, I was 16 and absolutely convinced that I was going to pass my driving test on the first try. I'd been practicing with my dad for months. I knew all the rules of the road by heart, and I'd watched enough YouTube videos about parallel parking to consider myself an expert. All my friends had passed on their first attempt, so naturally I would too. The night before my test, I could barely sleep. I kept visualizing myself acing the parallel parking, executing perfect three-point turns, and walking out of the DMV with my shiny new license. I'd already made plans to drive myself to school on Monday, and had been bragging to everyone about how I was definitely going to pass. My appointment was at 10 a.m. on a Saturday morning. My dad drove me to the DMV, and I spent the ride going over everything one more time in my head. I felt confident and prepared, maybe even a little cocky about how easy this was going to be. The testing instructor was this middle-aged woman who looked like she'd seen every possible mistake a teenage driver could make. The first part of the test went smoothly. I checked my mirrors, adjusted my seat, and pulled out of the DMV parking lot with what I thought was textbook precision. We drove through a residential neighbourhood where I carefully observed every speed limit, came to complete stops at stop signs, and signalled well in advance of every turn. Then came the parallel parking portion, and everything fell apart. The space looked smaller than the ones I'd practiced in, and there was actual traffic waiting behind me while I attempted to manoeuvre into the spot. I lined up next to the front car like I'd been taught, put the car in reverse, and immediately knew something was wrong. Instead of sliding smoothly into the space, I was at completely the wrong angle. I tried to correct it while still backing up, which only made things worse. I ended up with the back of the car sticking out into traffic and the front bumper about 6 inches from the car in front of me. The instructor calmly told me to pull forward and try again. My second attempt was even worse. I overcorrected from my first mistake and ended up too close to the curb, with the car sitting diagonally across the parking space. By this point, there were 3 cars waiting behind me, and I could feel my face getting red with embarrassment. The instructor finally told me to just pull forward and continue with the test. The rest of the test was a disaster because I was so flustered from the parallel parking failure. I rolled through a stop sign without realising it, forgot to check my blind spot during a lane change, and took a turn too fast in the DMV parking lot. When we got back to the building, the instructor handed me a paper with all my mistakes listed in neat handwriting. I had failed spectacularly, and not just barely failed. I'd made enough mistakes to fail twice over. The instructor was professional about it, explaining that I could retake the test in 2 weeks and suggesting that I practice more before coming back. I walked back to where my dad was waiting, trying not to cry from embarrassment. The ride home was quiet and humiliating. I'd been so confident, so sure that I was ready, and I'd completely fallen apart under pressure. My dad tried to be encouraging, saying that lots of people fail their first time, but I knew he was disappointed too. We'd both expected me to pass, and now I had to explain to everyone why I still didn't have my license. But failing that test turned out to be exactly what I needed. Instead of just assuming I was a good driver, I had to face the reality that I needed more practice. My dad and I spent the next 2 weeks working specifically on the skills I'd failed, especially parallel parking. We found empty parking lots and practiced the manoeuvre over and over until I could do it perfectly every time. We also worked on staying calm under pressure, practicing in busier areas with more traffic and distractions. My dad taught me breathing techniques for managing test anxiety and reminded me that making one mistake didn't mean the whole test was ruined. He helped me understand that confidence was good, but overconfidence could be dangerous. When I retook the test 2 weeks later, I was genuinely prepared instead of just thinking I was prepared. I parallel parked smoothly on the first try, executed every maneuver calmly and correctly, and passed with only one minor deduction for following too closely at one point. More importantly, I was actually a better driver because of those extra 2 weeks of focused practice. If I'd passed the first time, I would have thought I was ready when I really wasn't. Failing forced me to acknowledge my weaknesses and work on them systematically instead of just hoping everything would work out. That experience taught me valuable lessons about preparation and humility that extended far beyond driving. I learned that feeling confident doesn't mean you're actually ready, and that sometimes failure is exactly the feedback you need to improve. It showed me that embarrassment is temporary, but the skills you develop by learning from failure last forever. Now, whenever I'm preparing for something important, I remember my failed driving test and make sure I'm actually ready, not just confident. That embarrassing Saturday morning taught me that real preparation means practicing until you can succeed, even when things don't go perfectly, not just when everything goes according to plan. That story comes to an end there. Getting knocked down by overconfidence was exactly the wake-up call that OP needed to become a genuinely skilled driver. Sometimes failure is the best teacher because it forces you to confront the gap between how ready you think you are and how ready you actually are. That extra 2 weeks of practice probably prevented years of bad driving habits. Let's move to a story about the kindness of strangers and how 25 cents can completely change someone's day. The stranger who paid for my bus fare. I was 19 and running late for my shift at the bookstore downtown. I'd overslept, couldn't find my usual bus pass, and was frantically digging through my backpack looking for exact change while the bus idled at my stop. The driver was patient, but I could feel the other passengers getting annoyed as I searched through every pocket and compartment. Finally, I found $2.20 in various coins scattered throughout my bag. The fare was $2.50. I was 30 cents short, which might as well have been $30 when you're standing on a bus holding up everyone's morning commute. I started to explain my situation to the driver, asking if there was any way he could let me pay the difference tomorrow. Before the driver could respond, this woman sitting in the front seat reached into her purse and dropped 3 quarters into the fare box. She didn't make eye contact or say anything, just quietly covered my shortfall and went back to reading her newspaper like nothing had happened. I was so surprised that I just stood there for a moment, trying to process what had just occurred. This complete stranger had solved my problem without any fanfare or expectation of gratitude. She'd seen someone in need and helped immediately, no questions asked. I managed to stammer out a thank you, but she just nodded slightly and continued reading. I found a seat toward the back of the bus and spent the entire ride thinking about what had just happened. 30 cents was such a small amount of money, but in that moment it had been the difference between getting to work on time and having to walk 40 minutes downtown. What struck me most was how effortlessly she'd helped. There was no drama, no making me feel bad about my situation, no lecture about being more prepared. She'd simply seen a problem she could solve and solved it without drawing attention to herself or making me feel embarrassed about needing help. I made it to work with minutes to spare, and the rest of my day felt lighter because of that woman's kindness. Every time I thought about the interaction, I felt this warmth that had nothing to do with the money itself, and everything to do with the reminder that strangers could be generous for no reason other than basic human decency. Over the following weeks, I found myself looking for opportunities to pay forward that kindness. When I saw someone ahead of me, in line at the coffee shop, whose card got declined, I'd offer to cover their drink. If tourists looked confused about bus routes, I'd give them directions and sometimes even ride an extra stop to make sure they got where they needed to go. None of these gestures cost me much, just like those 3 quarters hadn't cost the woman much. But I remembered how much her help had meant to me, and I hoped my small acts of kindness might have the same impact on other people's days. The experience taught me that helping others doesn't require grand gestures or significant sacrifice. Sometimes the most meaningful assistance is quiet and immediate, addressing someone's immediate need without making them feel worse about their situation. That woman showed me how to help gracefully, without turning charity into a performance or making the recipient feel indebted. Years later, I still carry extra change in my pocket specifically for moments like that one. I've paid bus fares for students who came up short, covered parking meters that were about to expire, and helped countless people with small amounts they needed for various purchases. Each time I remember that woman with her newspaper and try to help with the same quiet efficiency she demonstrated. That 30 cents taught me more about generosity than any grand gesture ever could. It showed me that kindness doesn't have to be complicated or expensive. It just has to be genuine and immediate. Sometimes the smallest acts of help create the biggest impact because they restore someone's faith in human decency exactly when they need it most. That story ends there. 25 cents and a moment of grace from a stranger became a lifetime lesson in quiet generosity. The OP learned that the best kind of help doesn't draw attention to itself. It just solves the problem and moves on. Sometimes the most powerful kindness is the kind that asks for nothing in return, not even recognition. Our next story takes us into family dynamics and how the fights that hurt us most can sometimes lead us to the deepest understanding. The argument with my sister that made us closer. Emma and I had been best friends our entire lives, despite being 3 years apart in age. We shared clothes, secrets, and inside jokes that could make us laugh until our sides hurt. Growing up, people always said we were lucky to have such a close relationship with our sibling, and we genuinely felt that way too. The fight started over something that seems ridiculous now, but felt earth-shattering at the time. Our grandmother had passed away and left behind this beautiful vintage necklace that both Emma and I had always admired. The will said it should go to the granddaughters, but didn't specify which one of us should get it. Emma, being older, felt like she had the natural claim to it. I felt like since I'd been the one visiting our grandmother every weekend during her final months, helping with groceries and keeping her company, I'd earned it through my dedication. Neither of us wanted to share it or take turns wearing it. We both wanted it to be ours completely. What started as a reasonable discussion quickly escalated into accusations and hurt feelings. Emma said I was being selfish, and that age should determine who got family heirlooms. I accused her of feeling entitled to everything just because she was born first, and brought up years of resentment about times when I felt she'd gotten preferential treatment from our parents. The argument got uglier as we both said things we'd been holding back for years. Emma told me I was immature and always played the victim when I didn't get my way. I told her she was spoiled and had never had to work for anything in her life. We dug up old grievances and threw them at each other like weapons, each trying to prove why we deserved the necklace more. Our parents tried to mediate, but we were both too angry and hurt to listen to reason. The fight ended with Emma taking the necklace and me storming out of the house, both of us in tears and saying things we immediately regretted. I didn't speak to her for the next 3 months, which was the longest we'd ever gone without talking. During those months of silence, I missed Emma constantly, but was too proud and stubborn to reach out. I'd see something funny and instinctively want to text it to her, then remember we weren't speaking. Family gatherings were awkward and tense, with both of us trying to act normal while obviously avoiding each other. The turning point came when Emma's boyfriend unexpectedly broke up with her right before Christmas. She'd been planning to spend the holidays with his family, and suddenly she was alone and heartbroken during what was supposed to be a happy time. Despite our fight, my first instinct was to call her and offer support. When I heard her crying on the phone, all of our argument about the necklace seemed petty and unimportant compared to my sister's genuine pain. I drove to her apartment that night with ice cream and tissues, and we talked until sunrise about her breakup, our fight, and how much we'd missed each other. Emma admitted that she'd felt guilty about taking the necklace every time she looked at it. She said she'd realised during our months of not speaking that having our grandmother's jewellery wasn't worth losing her relationship with her sister. I confessed that I'd been jealous of her confidence and success for years, and had used the necklace situation as an excuse to express resentments I'd been harbouring. We talked about our childhood and realised that we'd both felt insecure about different things. Emma had always felt pressure to be perfect as the older sister, while I'd felt like I was constantly trying to catch up and prove myself. Neither of us had understood what the other was going through because we'd been too focused on our own struggles. The conversation helped us understand each other in ways we never had before, despite living in the same house for 18 years. We learned that our relationship had been based more on habit and proximity than genuine understanding of each other's perspectives and feelings. Emma suggested that we share the necklace, alternating who kept it each year on our grandmother's birthday. That way, we'd both have time to wear it and feel connected to her memory, but we'd also have an annual ritual that kept us connected to each other. The sharing arrangement felt meaningful rather than like a compromise neither of us wanted. That fight, as painful as it was, taught us both that our relationship was more important than any material possession. It forced us to confront issues we'd been avoiding and to really listen to each other's feelings instead of just defending our own positions. The months of silence made us realize how much we valued having each other in our lives. Our relationship now is stronger and more honest than it ever was before that argument. We're better at addressing problems directly instead of letting resentments build up over time. We check in with each other regularly about how we're feeling and make sure neither of us is holding back frustrations that could explode later. The necklace still gets passed between us every year, but it's no longer about ownership. It's become a symbol of our renewed commitment to putting our relationship first and our willingness to share the things that matter most. That fight almost destroyed our sisterhood, but working through it taught us how to be better sisters to each other. That story comes to an end there. Sometimes the fights that threaten to destroy relationships end up strengthening them in ways neither person could have imagined. Emma and the OP learned that being sisters meant more than sharing blood or childhood memories. It meant choosing each other again after experiencing real conflict. That necklace became a symbol of forgiveness rather than the prize they'd originally fought over. Moving on to a story about learning through failure and how the kitchen can be one of the most humbling classrooms you'll ever encounter. The summer I learned to cook. I was 20 years old and moving into my first apartment with 2 roommates who both knew their way around a kitchen. Jake could make perfect pasta from scratch, and Sarah baked bread that smelled like heaven. I, on the other hand, had lived on dining hall food and my mum's cooking my entire life. My culinary skills were limited to making sandwiches, heating up frozen meals, and scrambling eggs when I was feeling ambitious. I'd never paid attention when my mum tried to teach me basic cooking techniques, assuming I'd figure it out eventually when I needed to. That summer, I realised eventually had arrived and I was completely unprepared. The first week in our new place, we decided to take turns cooking dinner for everyone as a way to save money and bond as roommates. Jake went first and made this incredible chicken marsala that tasted like something from a fancy restaurant. Sarah followed with homemade pizza that put delivery places to shame. Then it was my turn, and I decided to attempt something that seemed foolproof: spaghetti with meat sauce. I figured even I couldn't mess up boiling pasta and browning ground beef. I was spectacularly wrong about that assumption. Somehow I managed to burn the meat while leaving parts of it completely raw, which I didn't even know was physically possible. The pasta turned into a sticky, clumpy mess because I didn't use enough water and forgot to stir it. The jarred sauce I'd bought tasted like sweetened ketchup, and I'd added so much salt trying to improve it that the whole dish was basically inedible. Jake and Sarah were incredibly polite about the disaster I'd served them, but I could see them struggling to swallow each bite. We ended up ordering pizza that night, and I felt like a complete failure as an adult human being. How had I made it to age 20 without learning to feed myself properly? Instead of giving up, I decided to treat cooking like any other skill I needed to master. I bought a basic cookbook designed for people who'd never boiled water before and started with the absolute simplest recipes. I'm talking about things like how to make rice without burning it and how to cook chicken without poisoning anyone. The failures continued for weeks. I burned grilled cheese sandwiches, somehow made scrambled eggs that had the texture of rubber, and created a batch of cookies that came out of the oven looking like charcoal hockey pucks. Every mistake was frustrating, but I was learning something from each disaster. Jake and Sarah became my patient teachers, showing me basic techniques like how to tell when onions were properly sautéed and why you shouldn't flip meat too early. They taught me that cooking was about timing and temperature control, not just following recipes blindly. Most importantly, they showed me that everyone burns dinner sometimes, even experienced cooks. My first real success came about 6 weeks into the summer when I managed to make a decent stir-fry. The vegetables were still crisp, the chicken was cooked through but not dried out, and the sauce actually enhanced the flavours instead of overwhelming them. Jake and Sarah praised it genuinely, and I felt prouder of that simple meal than I had about any academic achievement. From there, I started getting more adventurous, trying recipes that required multiple steps and actual technique. I learned to make a proper tomato sauce from scratch, figured out how to season meat so it actually tasted like something, and mastered the art of cooking pasta al dente instead of mushy. Each successful meal built my confidence to try something slightly more challenging. I started experimenting with spices and herbs, learning how different flavours work together and when to add ingredients for maximum impact. Cooking became less about following instructions exactly and more about understanding the principles behind why certain techniques worked. By the end of the summer, I was making meals that I was actually proud to serve to other people. I could improvise when I didn't have exact ingredients, adjust seasoning by taste rather than measurement, and recover when something started going wrong during the cooking process. More importantly, I'd learned that cooking wasn't about being naturally talented or following recipes perfectly. It was about being patient with yourself during the learning process and understanding that every burned dinner was teaching you something important about heat control or timing. That summer in the kitchen taught me lessons that extended far beyond food preparation. I learned that most skills require practice and patience, that failure is a necessary part of learning, and that asking for help from more experienced people can accelerate your progress significantly. Now, 15 years later, cooking is one of my favourite ways to relax and express creativity. I love trying new techniques and flavour combinations, and some of my best memories involve sharing meals I've prepared with friends and family. But I still remember those early disasters, and I'm grateful for every burned piece of chicken that taught me how to do better next time. The kitchen taught me humility and persistence in ways that classroom learning never could. It showed me that even basic life skills require practice and patience, and that the satisfaction of mastering something through your own effort is worth all the failures along the way. That story ends there. Learning to cook taught that OP way more than just how to feed themselves properly. The kitchen became this brutal but honest teacher that showed them failure is just practice in disguise. There's something beautiful about turning disasters into skills through pure persistence, even when your roommates have to politely choke down inedible pasta. Let's move to a story about missed opportunities and how sometimes the things that ruin our plans end up creating something even better. The missed flight that changed my day. I was supposed to be on a 7 a.m. flight to Denver for a job interview that could have changed my entire career trajectory. I'd been preparing for weeks, researching the company, practicing answers to potential questions, and even bought a new suit specifically for this meeting. My alarm went off at 4:30 a.m. as planned, but somehow I'd set it for PM instead of AM. When I finally woke up naturally, around 6:45, I knew immediately that I was in serious trouble. The airport was 45 minutes away on a good day, and this was definitely not going to be a good day. I threw on clothes, grabbed my overnight bag, and called an Uber while running down the stairs of my apartment building. The driver was sympathetic and drove as fast as traffic would allow, but we both knew it was a lost cause. I spent the entire ride calling the airline, hoping for some miracle that would get me to Denver on time. When I finally made it to the gate at 7:15, the plane was already backing away from the terminal. I watched through the window as my career opportunity literally flew away without me. The gate agent was apologetic but firm. The next flight to Denver wasn't until 2 p.m, and my interview was scheduled for 10 a.m. Mountain Time. I called the company to explain what had happened, but their HR person was understanding only to a point. They couldn't reschedule because they were interviewing multiple candidates over 2 days, and my slot was the only opening they had. She said they'd keep my resume on file, but we both knew that was corporate speak for better luck next time. Since I'd already taken the day off work and had a non-refundable ticket, I decided to take the afternoon flight anyway. Maybe I could at least explore Denver for a few hours and salvage something positive from this disaster. I changed out of my interview clothes and tried to adjust my expectations for what was supposed to be a life-changing day. While waiting for my rescheduled flight, I was sitting in the airport cafe, feeling sorry for myself, when this woman at the next table started laughing at something on her laptop. Her laugh was so genuine and infectious that I couldn't help but smile, even in my frustrated state. She noticed me looking over and apologized for being loud, explaining that she was watching funny videos to distract herself from flight anxiety. We started talking, and I learned that her name was Rachel, and she was a graphic designer heading to Denver for a client meeting. I told her about my missed interview and how I was trying to turn a disaster into something resembling a vacation day. Rachel was incredibly sympathetic and started telling me about her own career path, how she'd built her freelance business from nothing and learned to roll with unexpected setbacks. During our conversation, she mentioned that her client meeting was with a startup that was actually looking to hire a full-time marketing manager. Based on what I'd told her about my background and experience, she thought I might be perfect for the position. She offered to introduce me to the founders if I was interested. 3 hours later, I was sitting in a trendy coffee shop in downtown Denver, having the most relaxed and engaging job interview of my life. The startup founders were young, enthusiastic, and looking for someone who could help them scale their marketing efforts as they grew. The conversation flowed naturally from professional topics to shared interests and career goals. They loved my ideas about their marketing strategy, and I was genuinely excited about the company's mission and potential for growth. By the end of our meeting, they were talking about next steps and asking when I could start. I got a job offer from them the following week, with better pay and benefits than the position I'd originally been interviewing for. More importantly, the company culture was a perfect fit for my personality and work style. The role allowed me to be creative and entrepreneurial in ways that a corporate position never would have. But the best part of missing that flight wasn't even getting the job. Rachel and I stayed in touch after that day, and she became one of my closest friends and most trusted professional mentors. She's helped me navigate career decisions, introduced me to other freelancers in her network, and taught me to see setbacks as opportunities for redirection rather than failures. We still laugh about how my inability to set an alarm properly led to both a great job and a lifelong friendship. If I'd made that original flight, I probably would have gotten the corporate position I thought I wanted, but I never would have met Rachel or discovered the startup that ended up being perfect for my career goals. That missed flight taught me that sometimes our plans need to fall apart so better opportunities can find us. It showed me the importance of staying open to unexpected possibilities, even when everything seems to be going wrong. Most importantly, it proved that the connections we make during difficult moments often turn out to be the most meaningful ones. Now, whenever my carefully planned schedules get disrupted, I try to remember that day in the airport cafe. Instead of panicking about what I'm missing, I look for what might be waiting for me instead. Some of my best opportunities have come from moments when my original plans completely fell apart. That story wraps up there. Missing that flight turned into the kind of plot twist that makes you believe in fate just a little bit, Rachel showing up at exactly the right moment with exactly the right connection feels like something out of a movie, but sometimes real life writes better scripts than fiction. The OP learned that disasters and opportunities often look identical until you get some distance from them. Moving on to a story about the power of belief and how one person's faith in your potential can completely change your trajectory. The teacher who believed in me. I was failing 3 classes and had basically given up on school by the time I ended up in Mr. Rodriguez's remedial math class junior year. This wasn't where ambitious students went. This was where kids like me landed when the regular curriculum had chewed them up and spit them out. I'd convinced myself that I was just naturally bad at academics, that some people were born smart and others weren't, and I clearly fell into the second category. My test scores were consistently terrible. I couldn't focus during lectures, and homework felt like trying to read a foreign language. Everyone seemed to grasp concepts that remained completely mysterious to me. Mr. Rodriguez was different from every other teacher I'd encountered. Instead of diving straight into equations and formulas, he started by asking each of us about our experiences with math and why we thought we were struggling. When my turn came, I mumbled something about not having a math brain and being naturally stupid at numbers. He looked directly at me and said something that stopped me cold. I don't believe in math brains. I believe in math confidence, and confidence can be built with the right approach and enough practice. He said it like he was stating a simple fact, not trying to make me feel better or boost my self-esteem. Over the next few weeks, Mr. Rodriguez worked with me individually to figure out where my understanding had broken down. He discovered that I was missing fundamental concepts from elementary school, which explained why more advanced topics seemed impossible. Instead of pushing me to catch up to grade level, he helped me fill in those gaps systematically. He explained that learning was like building a house. You couldn't construct the upper floors if the foundation wasn't solid. We spent time reviewing basic concepts that I should have mastered years earlier, but he never made me feel stupid or behind. He treated these sessions like detective work, helping me identify where my knowledge had holes and then fixing them methodically. The breakthrough came about 2 months into the semester when I successfully solved a complex equation that had been giving me trouble for days. It wasn't particularly advanced mathematics, but it required understanding several concepts that I'd never fully grasped before. When I got the right answer, Mr. Rodriguez smiled and said, "See, you do have a math brain. You just needed someone to help you organize it." That moment changed something fundamental in how I saw myself as a learner. For the first time in my academic life, I felt capable of understanding something that had always seemed impossible. Mr. Rodriguez continued working with me throughout the year, always pushing me just slightly beyond my comfort zone, while making sure I had the support I needed to succeed. By the end of junior year, I was passing all my classes for the first time in years. More importantly, I developed study strategies and learning techniques that worked for my particular brain. Mr. Rodriguez had taught me that struggling with certain subjects didn't mean I was stupid. It meant I learned differently and needed different approaches. Senior year, I took regular math classes instead of remedial ones. It was challenging, but I had the confidence and tools to handle the difficulty. I graduated on time with my class, something that had seemed impossible just 2 years earlier when I was seriously considering dropping out. Mr. Rodriguez came to my graduation ceremony, and afterward I thanked him for everything he'd done for me. He said something that day that I still carry with me 20 years later. He told me that intelligence isn't about being smart enough to understand concepts immediately. It's about being persistent enough to keep trying different approaches until something clicks. I went to community college after high school and eventually transferred to a 4-year university where I studied education. I wanted to become the kind of teacher who could help struggling students the way Mr. Rodriguez had helped me. I'm now a high school teacher myself, working with kids who remind me of my 16-year-old self. Every time I have a student who thinks they're too stupid to learn, I remember what Mr. Rodriguez taught me about the difference between intelligence and confidence. I share his philosophy that there are no subjects some people just can't learn. Only different ways of processing information and different amounts of time needed to build understanding. Mr. Rodriguez didn't just save my academic career. He taught me that one person believing in your potential can completely change your perception of what you're capable of achieving. That lesson has influenced every aspect of my life, not just my education, but my relationships, career, and approach to challenges in general. The most important thing he taught me wasn't mathematics, it was that labels like smart and stupid are often just excuses for not finding the right teaching approach. Every student can learn when they have the right support, and someone who refuses to give up on them. That story ends there. Mr. Rodriguez understood that confidence matters more than natural ability, and his refusal to accept that some kids just aren't math people completely transformed that OP's life trajectory. One teacher's belief became the foundation for an entire career in education. Sometimes, the most powerful thing an adult can do for a young person is see their potential when they can't see it themselves. Let's move to a story about unconditional love and the lessons that come from our relationships with the animals who choose to love us completely. The dog that taught me loyalty. When I was 10 years old, my family adopted Max from the local animal shelter. He was a medium-sized mixed breed, probably part lab and part something else, with expressive brown eyes and ears that always seemed to be listening carefully to whatever you had to say. Max had been at the shelter for 6 months, which the volunteers said was unusually long for a dog with his temperament. He wasn't aggressive or difficult, just quiet and reserved in a way that made potential adopters pass him by in favour of more energetic puppies who jumped up on the kennel doors seeking attention. When we met Max in the visitation room, he didn't run around or try to play like the other dogs we'd seen that day. He simply walked over to where I was sitting on the floor and rested his chin on my knee. He looked up at me with those soulful eyes, and I knew immediately that he was supposed to come home with us. My parents tried to interest me in some of the younger, more playful dogs, pointing out that Max might not have as many years left and that a puppy might be more fun for a kid my age. But there was something about Max's quiet dignity and the way he'd immediately trusted me that made me feel protective of him. From the day we brought him home, Max became my constant companion. He slept next to my bed every night, walked with me to the bus stop every morning, and was always waiting by the front door when I came home from school. He wasn't particularly energetic or playful, but he was steady and reliable in a way that made me feel completely secure. What amazed me about Max was his unwavering loyalty to our entire family. When my baby sister was born 2 years later, he immediately appointed himself as her guardian. He would lie next to her crib during naps and gently alert my parents if she started crying during the night. He seemed to understand instinctively that she was precious and needed protection. Max taught me responsibility in ways I hadn't expected. Taking care of him wasn't just about feeding him and making sure he had water, though I took those duties seriously. It was about paying attention to his needs, noticing when he wasn't feeling well, and putting his comfort ahead of my own convenience sometimes. There were nights when I wanted to stay inside and watch TV, but I knew Max needed his evening walk. There were mornings when I was running late for school, but I still took time to let him out in the backyard and make sure he had fresh water. These daily acts of daily care taught me that love isn't just a feeling, it's a commitment to showing up consistently for someone who depends on you. As I got older and started spending more time with friends and extracurricular activities, Max never made me feel guilty for being away from home. He was always genuinely excited to see me when I returned, whether I'd been gone for 2 hours or 2 days. His happiness at my return was pure and uncomplicated, never tinged with resentment or demands for explanation about where I'd been. During my difficult teenage years, when I was moody and unpredictable, and probably not very pleasant to live with, Max remained a constant source of comfort and acceptance. He didn't judge me for my bad attitudes or try to fix my problems. He just stayed close by, offering his quiet presence when I needed it most. When I was dealing with typical teenage drama, friendship conflicts, or academic stress, I would often find myself sitting on the floor of my room, talking to Max about whatever was bothering me. He would listen with the kind of focused attention that made me feel heard and understood, even though he couldn't offer advice or solutions. Max lived to be 14, which gave us 8 wonderful years together. As he got older and his health started declining, I learned about the difficulty of loving someone whose time with you is limited. Watching him slow down and struggle with basic activities that had once been effortless was heartbreaking, but it also taught me to appreciate every ordinary moment we had together. The day we had to say goodbye to Max was one of the hardest days of my childhood, but even in that final moment at the veterinarian's office, he taught me something important about love and loyalty. He stayed calm and trusting, seeming to understand that we were making this choice out of love for him rather than giving up on him. Having Max during those formative years taught me that love is patient, consistent, and unconditional. He showed me what it means to be loyal, not just during the good times, but especially during the difficult ones. He demonstrated that sometimes the most meaningful relationships are built not on excitement or entertainment, but on quiet devotion and simple presence. Now, as an adult, I try to bring the same kind of steady loyalty to my human relationships that Max showed me every day for 8 years. When friends are going through hard times, I remember how much it meant to have someone who would just sit with me without trying to fix everything. When family members are struggling, I think about Max's example of offering comfort without judgment. Max taught me that loyalty isn't about grand gestures or dramatic declarations. It's about showing up consistently, paying attention to the people you love, and being willing to put their needs ahead of your own convenience. Those lessons have shaped how I approach friendships, romantic relationships, and eventually parenthood. That story ends there. Max showed the OP what pure, uncomplicated love looks like, the kind that doesn't keep score or hold grudges. An older shelter dog became the perfect teacher for a young person learning about responsibility, consistency, and what it really means to care for someone else. Sometimes the most profound lessons about human connection come from our relationships with animals who love us exactly as we are. Our next story takes us to one of those childhood moments that stays with you forever, teaching you about safety, love, and just how much you mean to the people who would do anything to protect you. The day I got lost as a child. I was 5 years old and at the state fair with my parents and little brother. It was one of those perfect family outings that I'd been looking forward to for weeks. The fair had everything a kid could want: carnival rides, games with giant stuffed animal prizes, and more cotton candy than I could eat in a lifetime. We'd spent the afternoon going on rides and playing games, and I was carrying a huge stuffed elephant I'd won at the ring toss. My little brother was getting tired and cranky, so my parents decided we should head toward the exit and call it a day. I was disappointed because I hadn't gotten to go on the Ferris wheel yet, but I understood that we needed to leave before my brother had a complete meltdown. As we were walking through the crowded midway toward the parking area, something caught my eye at one of the game booths. There was this incredible remote control helicopter that looked exactly like the one I'd been begging my parents to buy me for months. The man running the booth was demonstrating how it worked, making it hover and spin in the air above the crowd. I stopped to watch, completely mesmerized by this helicopter. I was only planning to look for a minute, but the demonstration was so fascinating that I lost track of time. When I finally turned around to catch up with my family, they were nowhere to be seen. At first, I wasn't too concerned. The fair was crowded, and I figured they were just a few steps ahead of me, maybe blocked by other people. I walked in the direction we'd been heading, looking for my dad's red baseball cap or my mum's blue sweater, but after walking for what felt like forever, I still couldn't see them anywhere. That's when the panic started to set in. The crowds that had seemed fun and exciting just minutes earlier now felt overwhelming and scary. Everyone around me was a stranger, and they all seemed so much taller than me. I couldn't see over their heads to look for my family, and the noise of the carnival games and music made it impossible to hear if my parents were calling my name. I started walking faster, then almost running, clutching my stuffed elephant and trying not to cry. Every person wearing a red hat made my heart jump, thinking it might be my dad, but it was always someone else. I began to imagine all the terrible things that could happen to a lost child at a fair, and I was getting more frightened by the minute. After what felt like hours but was probably only 15 minutes, I decided to stop moving and stay in one place like I'd been taught in school during stranger danger lessons. I found a bench near one of the food stands and climbed up on it so I'd be easier to spot. I was crying by this point, but trying to be brave and remember what my parents had always told me about what to do if I got separated from them. A kind woman who was working at the nearby funnel cake stand noticed me sitting alone and crying. She came over and asked if I was lost, and when I nodded, she told me she was going to help me find my family. She walked me over to the security booth near the main entrance, holding my hand and talking to me in a calm, reassuring voice. The security guard was this friendly older man who asked me my name and what my parents looked like. He got on his radio and started describing me to other security personnel around the fair. Then he asked if I wanted to make an announcement over the loudspeaker system to let my parents know where I was. Hearing my own voice echoing across the entire fairgrounds was both scary and exciting. I said, "Mommy and Daddy, this is Emma. I'm at the security booth by the front gate with Officer Jim. Please come find me." My voice sounded so small over that big speaker system, but I hoped my parents would hear it wherever they were. Within minutes, I could see my dad running toward the security booth, moving faster than I'd ever seen him run before. My mum was right behind him, and when they reached me, they both grabbed me in the biggest, tightest hug of my life. My mum was crying almost as hard as I was, and my dad kept saying, "We're so sorry, sweetheart. We're so sorry we lost you." They explained that they'd been looking for me frantically for the past 20 minutes. When they realised I wasn't with them, they'd split up to cover more ground, with my dad searching the midway while my mum stayed near the car in case I made my way to the parking lot. They'd been terrified and were about to ask for help from security when they heard my announcement over the speaker. The ride home was quiet except for my parents occasionally asking if I was okay and reminding me how much they loved me. My little brother had fallen asleep in his car seat, completely unaware of the drama that had unfolded. I sat in the back clutching my stuffed elephant, feeling simultaneously exhausted and incredibly safe. That night, as my mum was tucking me into bed, she talked to me about what had happened and how scared she and my dad had been when they couldn't find me. She explained that sometimes parents make mistakes too, and that they should have been more careful to make sure I was keeping up with them in the crowded fair. But what struck me most was how my mum described the feeling of not knowing where I was. She said it was the worst feeling she'd ever experienced, that all she could think about was making sure I was safe and getting me back in her arms. She told me that being my mum was the most important job she'd ever have, and that protecting me and my brother was her top priority in life. That experience taught me something profound about how much my parents loved me. I'd always known they cared about me, but seeing their panic and relief when they found me showed me the depth of that love in a way I'd never understood before. It made me realise that I wasn't just a kid they were responsible for. I was someone whose safety and well-being was central to their happiness. Getting lost also taught me important lessons about staying calm in scary situations and asking for help when I needed it. The security guard and the woman from the funnel cake stand showed me that most people are kind and want to help children who are in trouble. Learning to trust appropriate adults in emergency situations became an important life skill. From that day forward, my parents were much more vigilant about keeping track of me and my brother in crowded places. We developed a system where I had to check in with them every few minutes, and they made sure I knew our phone number and address in case I ever got separated from them again. But more than the practical safety lessons, that day taught me about the fierce protective love that parents have for their children. Understanding how much my disappearance had frightened my mum and dad made me appreciate the security and love that surrounded me every day, even when I took it for granted. That story concludes there. Getting lost for 20 minutes taught that OP more about parental love than years of everyday family life ever could. Seeing the panic and relief in her parents' faces showed her just how precious she was to them, turning a scary experience into a profound lesson about family bonds. Sometimes we have to experience a moment of feeling unprotected to truly appreciate the safety net of love that usually surrounds us. Well, that brings us to the end of today's collection of life lessons from people who are brave enough to share their stories. Whether you connected with the person who finally learned to set boundaries, the teenager who discovered work ethic behind a grill, or the child who realized just how much their parents loved them, I hope these moments reminded you that growth often comes from the experiences we least expect. Consider subscribing for more Reddit stories just like these every evening. Thanks for spending this time with me, and remember that your own story is still being written, one lesson at a time. Take care.